The first thing Draco noticed was the softness of the pillow beneath his cheek. It was wrong, all wrong. The pillows in his flat, dingy, cramped space he'd been hiding in since the war and dead were thin and lumpy, stuffed with something that might have been feathers once, but had long since degraded into clumps of scratchy nothing. This pillow was plush, expensive, the kind of luxury he hadn't experienced in years. The sheets, too, were silk against his skin, cool and smooth, smelling faintly of lavender and something else he couldn't quite place. Draco's eyes snapped open. Green. Everything was green. The bed hangings, heavy velvet curtains embroidered with silver thread, enclosed him in a cocoon of emerald darkness. Through a gap in the fabric, he could see the familiar undulating light that could only mean one thing. He was underwater, or rather, beneath a lake. The Slytherin dormitory. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm that made his breath come short. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be possible. He'd been in his flat, drinking himself into oblivion as he did most nights, trying to forget the weight of the dark mark on his arm, trying to forget the screams that echoed through Malfoy Manor, trying to forget the look in Dumbledore's eyes when Draco had failed to kill him. He sat up too quickly, and the room spun. His hands, Merlin, his hands were smaller, smoother. The knuckles weren't scarred from where Goyle had accidentally hit him during a botched spell in sixth year. The dark mark was gone, his left forearm pale and unblemished. Draco scrambled out of bed, his feet hitting the cold stone floor, and stumbled toward the mirror that hung on the wall between his bed and Crabbe's. What he saw there made his knees buckle. 14. He looked 14 years old. His face was rounder, softer, without the gaunt hollows that had appeared during sixth year and never quite left. His hair was styled the way he'd worn it in fourth year, slicked back with perhaps a bit too much product. The way he'd thought made him look sophisticated, but really just made him look like he was trying too hard. His eyes, those same grey eyes that had stared back at him from the mirror every morning for years, were wider, less haunted, still holding some spark of arrogance that the war had thoroughly beaten out of him. "No," he whispered, his voice cracking. Even his voice was higher, not yet deepened fully by puberty. No, 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 this can't be, but it was. Somehow, impossibly, he was back in his fourth year at Hogwarts. The date on the calendar that hung above Theo Nart's bed confirmed it, November 15th, 1994. Draco's stomach lurched, and for a moment he thought he might be sick right there on the dormitory floor. November 15th, 1994. The Triwizard Tournament was underway. Potter had just been selected as the fourth champion, much to everyone's shock and Draco's vocal displeasure. The Dark Lord hadn't yet returned to power. Draco's father was still a respected member of wizarding society, not a disgraced Death Eater rotting in Azkaban, and Draco himself was still innocent, still untouched by the horrors that would come, but not for long. In less than 2 years, Voldemort would return. In less than 3, Draco would be branded with the Dark Mark, given an impossible task, and forced to watch as his home became a headquarters for torture and murder. He would fail to kill Dumbledore. He would watch Snape do it instead. He would fight in a war that would leave him broken and hollow, despised by both sides, trusted by no one. Unless he changed it. The thought struck him like a lightning bolt, so powerful it made him stagger. He could change it. He was here now with knowledge of everything that would happen. He could make different choices. He could refuse the mark. He could warn Dumbledore. He could number Draco's mind raced, analyzing the possibilities with the same cunning that had made him a Slytherin. Warning Dumbledore would require explaining how he knew what he knew, and no one would believe a 14-year-old Malfoy claiming to be from the future. Even if they did believe him, what then? His father would still be a Death Eater. Voldemort would still return. And Draco would still be expected to follow in Lucius's footsteps, to take the mark, to serve. The Malfoy name was a chain around his neck, and it would drag him down into darkness no matter what he did, unless he broke free of it entirely. The thought was so audacious, so completely mad, that for a moment Draco couldn't breathe. break free of the Malfoy name, abandon his family, his heritage, everything he'd been raised to value. It was unthinkable. It was betrayal of the highest order. It was also his only chance at survival. Draco looked at his reflection again, at this younger version of himself, who didn't yet know what it felt like to have someone die by his hand, who didn't yet wake up screaming from nightmares of Aunt Bellatrix's victims. This Draco still had a chance. This Draco could still escape. But he would have to be smart about it. Careful. One wrong move, one hint of his plans, and Lucius would lock him away in the manor until he came to his senses. His mother, for all her love, would never defy his father. And if Voldemort returned to find that Draco Malfoy had fled, he couldn't think about that. He had to focus on the plan. Draco spent the rest of that day in a daze, going through the motions of being a fourth-year student while his mind spun with possibilities and plans. He sat through potions, barely hearing Snape's lecture on strengthening solutions. He picked at his lunch in the Great Hall, watching Potter and his friends laugh together at the Gryffindor table and feeling a strange, distant envy. He'd never had friends like that. Crabbe and Goyle were more like bodyguards than companions, and even Pansy's affection was more about the prestige of being associated with a Malfoy than any genuine feeling. He'd been so alone, he realized. Even before the war, even in the midst of Slytherin House, he'd been isolated by his name and his father's expectations. That night, long after his dormmates had fallen asleep, Draco lay in his four-poster bed and stared at the green velvet canopy above him. The undulating light from the lake cast strange shadows across the fabric, making it seem like the whole room was underwater, drowning. He couldn't stay here. He couldn't follow the path that had been laid out for him. But where could he go? Not anywhere in Britain. The Malfoy name was too well known, too powerful. His father had connections everywhere in the wizarding world. Even if Draco ran, Lucius would find him, drag him back, and ensure he never had the chance to escape again. But the Muggle world, that was different. Wizards, even powerful ones like his father, were often helpless in the Muggle world. They didn't understand it, didn't know how to navigate it. And in America, thousands of miles away, the Malfoy name would mean nothing. He could disappear into the vast Muggle population, become someone else entirely. The plan began to take shape in his mind, piece by careful piece. First, he would need money. Galleons wouldn't do him much good in the Muggle world, but they could be converted. Gringotts offered currency exchange services for wizards who needed to interact with Muggles, though it was considered rather déclassé in pure-blood circles. Draco would need a substantial amount enough to establish himself in America, to live on while he figured out how to survive in the Muggle world, which meant he would have to steal from his father. The thought made his stomach clench, with a mixture of fear and something that might have been satisfaction. Lucius Malfoy, who had pushed his son toward darkness, who had handed him over to the Dark Lord like a prize, who had cared more about power and prestige than his own son's Suli's, Draco would steal from him. He would take what he needed to escape, and he wouldn't feel guilty about it. But getting into his father's vault would be nearly impossible. Lucius kept his most valuable possessions locked away in a private vault at Malfoy Manor, protected by wards and charms that Draco barely understood. The only time the vault was accessible was when Lucius himself opened it, and he did so rarely, only when he needed to retrieve something specific. Unless Christmas break. Draco's mind raced. During Christmas break, he would be at the manor. Lucius always opened the vault during the holidays to retrieve gifts and to count his gold, a ritual he performed with almost religious devotion. If Draco could find a way to slip in while his father was distracted, if he could be quick and careful enough, it was dangerous. If he was caught, the consequences would be severe. But what choice did he have? Over the next 3 weeks, Draco became a model student. He attended every class, completed every assignment, and kept his head down. He stopped taunting Potter, much to everyone's surprise, and when Pansy asked him what was wrong, he claimed he was simply bored with the whole thing. Let them think he was maturing, becoming more sophisticated. It was better than the truth. In secret, he studied. He spent hours in the library, researching Muggle America, trying to understand how their world worked. He learned about something called social security numbers and credit cards, about apartments and jobs, and all the mundane details of Muggle life that he'd never bothered to consider before. He read about American cities, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, trying to decide where he might disappear most easily. He also practiced lying. Every night, he would stand in front of the mirror and rehearse the story he would tell his parents. He was doing well in school. He was looking forward to Christmas. He had no plans beyond enjoying the holiday with his family. The lies had to be perfect, delivered with just the right amount of casual indifference. Lucius could smell desperation like a shark smelled blood in the water. The weeks crawled by with agonizing slowness. Every day, Draco woke up half expecting to find himself back in his own time, the whole thing revealed as some kind of elaborate dream. But every morning he was still 14, still in the Slytherin dormitory, still trapped in a body that felt both familiar and foreign. Finally, mercifully, the term ended. Students packed their trunks and boarded the Hogwarts Express, chattering excitedly about Christmas plans. Draco sat alone in a compartment, watching the Scottish countryside roll past the window, and tried to calm the frantic beating of his heart. This was it. In a few hours, he would be at Malfoy Manor. In a few days, if everything went according to plan, he would be stealing from his father. And shortly after that, he would be gone, vanished into the Muggle world like smoke. The manor looked exactly as he remembered it called, imposing, more mausoleum than home. The white peacocks strutted across the grounds, their cries echoing in the winter air. Narcissa met him at the door, elegant in dark green robes, her face lighting up with genuine pleasure at the sight of her son. "Draco, darling," she said, pulling him into an embrace that smelled of expensive perfume and something floral. "We've missed you so." Guilt twisted in Draco's chest. His mother loved him in her way. She had always loved him, had tried to protect him even when it meant defying the Dark Lord himself. In his original timeline, she had lied to Voldemort's face to save him. And now he was going to leave her without a word, without explanation, without even a goodbye. But he couldn't tell her. She would try to stop him, or worse, she would tell Lucius, and then everything would be over. "I've missed you too, Mother," he said, and it wasn't entirely a lie. Lucius appeared in the doorway of his study, tall and imposing, his long platinum hair falling over his shoulders. His Caneth one with his wand concealed inside tapped against the marble floor as he approached. "Draco," he said, his voice cool and measured. "I trust your term was productive." "Yes, father," Draco replied, falling easily into the role of dutiful son. "My marks are excellent, as always." "Good." Lucius's grey eyes, like Draco's, own studied him for a moment, and Draco had to fight the urge to squirm under that penetrating gaze. "We have much to discuss over the holiday. The Dark Lord's return is imminent, and when it comes, the Malfoy family must be ready to reclaim our rightful place." Draco's blood ran cold, but he kept his expression neutral. "Of course, father." That night, lying in his childhood bedroom with its dark wood furniture and silver accents, Draco stared at the ceiling and tried to steady his breathing. Lucius had just confirmed what Draco already knew: Voldemort's return was coming, and the Malfoys would be expected to serve. Which meant Draco's window of opportunity was even smaller than he'd thought. He had to act soon, very soon. For the next few days, Draco watched his father's movements with careful attention. Lucius kept to a strict routine. Breakfast at 8, correspondence in his study until noon, lunch, then various activities in the afternoon, sometimes meetings with other pureblood families, sometimes inspections of the manor's wards, sometimes simply reading in the library. Dinner was at 7, formal and silent, except for occasional conversation about politics or society gossip. On the third day of the holiday, Draco's opportunity came. Lucius announced at breakfast that he would be traveling to London that afternoon to meet with several members of the Wisengamot. He would be gone for at least 3 hours, possibly longer. Narcissa planned to spend the afternoon in her greenhouse, tending to her collection of rare magical plants. Draco's heart began to race. This was it. This was his chance. He waited until after lunch, until he heard the crack of apparition that signaled his father's departure. Then he waited another 30 minutes, just to be sure. His mother's greenhouse was on the far side of the manor grounds. She wouldn't hear anything from there. The vault was in the dungeons, hidden behind a portrait of Armand Malfoy, one of Draco's ancestors who had been particularly skilled at dark magic. Draco had only been inside the vault a handful of times, always with his father, always under strict supervision. But he remembered the way. He made his way down the stone stairs, his footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every sound made him jump. What if Lucius had left some kind of alarm? What if the house elves reported his movements? What if no? He couldn't think like that. He had to focus. The portrait of Armand Malfoy sneered down at him as he approached. "What business have you here, boy?" the painted figure demanded. "I need to retrieve something for father," Draco lied smoothly. "He asked me to fetch it while he was away." The portrait's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Lucius said nothing to me about this." Draco's mind raced. He needed to get past this portrait, but he couldn't use force that would definitely trigger alarms. He needed to be clever. "Father is meeting with members of the Wisengamot," Draco said, injecting just the right amount of impatience into his voice. "He forgot an important document and sent me an owl asking me to retrieve it. If you'd like to explain to him why you delayed me, causing him embarrassment in front of his colleagues, I'm sure he'll be very understanding." The threat worked. Armand's painted face paled slightly, and after a moment's hesitation, the portrait swung open, revealing a heavy wooden door beyond. The door itself was locked, but Draco had anticipated this. He'd spent hours in the library researching unlocking charms, practicing on the locks in empty classrooms. His wand hand trembled slightly as he pointed it at the lock. "Alohomora," he whispered. Nothing happened, of course. Lucius wouldn't use such a simple locking charm. Draco tried again, this time with a more advanced unlocking spell he'd found in a book on security wards. Poor Tabito. Still nothing. Sweat began to bead on Draco's forehead. He was running out of time. His mother could return to the manor at any moment. Lucius could finish his meeting early. He needed to get inside now. Then he remembered a conversation he'd overheard years ago in his original timeline when Lucius had been teaching him about the manor's defenses. The vault door wasn't locked with a spell at all. It was blood-locked, keyed to Malfoy blood. Draco pulled a small knife from his pocket, brought it just in case, and pricked his finger. A drop of blood welled up, bright red against his pale skin. He pressed it against the door handle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door clicked softly and swung open. The vault was smaller than he'd remembered, but no less impressive. Shelves lined the walls, filled with artifacts and treasures accumulated over generations of Malfoys. There were books bound in dragon hide, jewelry that glittered with protective enchantments, weapons that hummed with dark magic. And in the center of the room, sitting on a raised platform, were several large chests filled with gold. Draco's hands shook as he approached the nearest chest. He brought a small bag with an undetectable extension charmed, borrowed it from a seventh-year student's trunk, and now he began filling it with galleons. He worked quickly but carefully, trying not to take so much that the theft would be immediately obvious. A few hundred galleons from each chest, spread out so the loss wouldn't be noticeable at first glance. The gold was heavy, heavier than he'd expected. Each coin seemed to weigh down not just his bag, but his conscience. He was stealing from his father. He was betraying his family. He was saving himself. Draco grabbed one more handful of galleons, then forced himself to stop. He had enough. More than enough, probably. Now he just needed to get out. He closed the chests carefully, making sure they looked undisturbed. Then he backed toward the door, his eyes scanning the room for anything out of place, any sign that someone had been here. Satisfied, he slipped out into the corridor and closed the door behind him. It locked with a soft click. The portrait of Armand Malfoy swung back into place, and Draco let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Did you find what you needed?" Armand asked, his painted eyes suspicious. "Yes," Draco said. "Thank you." He walked back up the stairs on shaking legs, the bag of stolen gold heavy against his side. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Now came the hard part. The rest of the holiday passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Draco attended Christmas dinner, exchanged gifts with his parents, and smiled and nodded through his father's lectures about the importance of pure-blood supremacy and the glorious future that awaited them when the Dark Lord returned. Every word was like a knife twisting in his gut, but he kept his expression neutral, his responses appropriate. Narcissa gave him a new set of dress robes, emerald green with silver threading. Lucius gave him a book on advanced defensive magic, along with a lecture about the importance of being prepared for the coming war. Draco thanked them both and tried not to think about the fact that he would never wear those robes, never read that book, never see his parents again after he left. On the last day of the holiday, before returning to Hogwarts, Draco stood in his bedroom and looked around at all the trappings of his privileged life. The expensive furniture, the shelves full of books, the wardrobe full of tailored robes, all of it would be left behind. He was about to trade luxury for uncertainty, safety for freedom. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. He was ready. Back at Hogwarts, Draco waited exactly 1 week before making his move. He needed to establish a pattern of normalcy to make sure no one suspected anything unusual. He attended classes, completed his homework, even participated in a few Quidditch practices. To all outward appearances, he was simply Draco Malfoy, Slytherin prince, going about his usual business. But inside, he was counting down the hours. On a Saturday morning in mid-January, Draco told his housemates he was going to Hogsmeade for the day. It wasn't unusual students were allowed to visit the village on weekends, and Draco often went to stock up on sweets or browse the shops. No one questioned it. Instead of going to Hogsmeade, Draco slipped away to a secluded spot near the edge of the Forbidden Forest and apparated to London. He'd been practicing apparition in Secretite, was illegal for underage wizards, but he'd learned how in 6th year, and the knowledge had carried over. The journey was rough, and he landed in a stumbling heap in a dirty alley near the Leaky Cauldron, but he'd made it. Diagon Alley was crowded with weekend shoppers, which was perfect. Draco pulled his hood up and kept his head down, just another anonymous wizard going about his business. He made his way to Gringotts, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. The goblin at the currency exchange counter looked at him with undisguised disdain. "Yes," it said, its voice sharp and impatient. "I need to exchange galleons for Muggle currency," Draco said, trying to keep his voice steady. "American dollars." The goblin's eyes narrowed. "How much?" 500 galleons. It was a substantial amount, roughly 2,500 pounds, or about 4,000 American dollars. Enough to get him started, to rent an apartment and live on for a few months while he figured out how to survive in the Muggle world. The goblin studied him for a long moment, and Draco was certain it was going to refuse, or worse, ask questions about where a 14-year-old had gotten so much gold. But finally, it simply shrugged and began counting out bills. "There will be a fee," it said. 10%. Draco nodded. He'd expected as much. "That's fine." 20 minutes later, he walked out of Gringotts with a thick envelope full of American currency tucked safely in his bag. The first part of his plan was complete. The second part was trickier. He needed identification, Muggle identification, that would allow him to rent an apartment, possibly get a job, exist in their world without raising suspicion. He couldn't use his real name. Lucius would be able to track him too easily. He needed to become someone else entirely. Draco had done his research. There was a shop in Nocturne Alley, hidden behind a false wall in Borgin and Burke's, that specialized in forged documents. It was run by a witch named Mundungus Fletcher's Cussiner, so the rumors said and it catered to wizards who needed to disappear into the Muggle world for various reasons, most of them illegal. Finding the shop was harder than he'd expected. Nocturne Alley was a maze of dark storefronts and suspicious characters, and Draco had to ask for directions 3 times before he finally found the right place. The shop had no sign, just a plain black door wedged between a shop selling cursed jewelry and another that advertised venomous tentacular sea sheep. Draco knocked 3 times, as he'd been instructed. The door opened a crack, and a woman's face peered out. She was middle-aged, with graying hair and sharp eyes that took in every detail of Draco's appearance in an instant. "What do you want?" she asked. "I need papers," Draco said quietly. "Muggle papers. American." The woman's eyes narrowed. "You're a bit young for that sort of thing, aren't you?" "I can pay," Draco said, and pulled out a handful of galleons. The woman's expression softened slightly. She opened the door wider and gestured for him to come inside. The shop was cramped and cluttered, filled with filing cabinets and stacks of parchment. A magical quill sat on the desk, writing furiously on its own, filling out what looked like a birth certificate. "American papers aren't cheap," the woman said, settling into a chair behind the desk. "Birth certificate, social security card, driver's license. I will need all of them if you want to pass as a Muggle. That'll be 200 galleons." Draco's stomach clenched. That was a significant chunk of his stolen gold, but what choice did he have? "Fine," he said. "I'll need a name," the woman said, pulling out a fresh piece of parchment. "Not your real one, obviously." Draco hesitated. He'd thought about this, practiced different names in his head, but now that the moment was here, his mind went blank. He needed something common, something that wouldn't stand out, something completely unlike Draco Malfoy. "Daniel," he said finally. "Daniel Morgan." It was plain, unremarkable, perfectly Muggle. The woman nodded and began writing. "Age, 14. Birth date." Draco gave her a date in June, making himself a few months older than he actually was. The woman continued asking questions. Place of birth. He said Chicago, one of the cities he'd researched. Parents' names. He made them up on the spot. Address. He gave a fake one, knowing he'd need to find a real place to live once he got to America. 2 hours later, he walked out of the shop with a small folder containing his new identity. Daniel Morgan, age 14, born in Chicago, Illinois. It felt strange, holding these documents, seeing a name that wasn't his own printed on official-looking paper. But it also felt like freedom. He had one more stop to make before returning to Hogwarts. At a Muggle travel agency tucked away in a corner of Londonan of the few that catered to wizards who needed to book Muggle transportation, purchased a plane ticket to New York City, departing in 3 days. 3 days. That was all the time he had left. Back at Hogwarts, Draco went through the motions of being a student one last time. He attended classes, though he barely heard what the professors were saying. He ate meals in the Great Hall, though the food tasted like ash in his mouth. He slept in his 4-poster bed in the Slytherin dormitory, though sleep was nearly impossible. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. How could he? Crabbe and Goyle wouldn't understand. Pansy would try to stop him, or worse, tell someone, and everyone else. Well, they'd never really been his friends anyway. On his last night at Hogwarts, Draco stood at the window of the Slytherin common room and looked out at the lake. The giant squid drifted past, its tentacles creating ripples in the dark water. Somewhere above, in the castle proper, students were laughing and studying and living their normal lives, completely unaware that one of their classmates was about to vanish. Draco thought about Potter, about Granger and Weasley, about all the people he'd tormented over the years. In another timeline, he would continue to torment them, would become their enemy in a war that would tear the wizarding world apart. But in this timeline, he would simply disappear. They would probably wonder what happened to him for a while, then forget about him entirely. Good. Let them forget. Let everyone forget Draco Malfoy. Daniel Morgan would be someone different, someone better. The next morning, before dawn, Draco packed a small bag with a few changes of Muggle clothes he'd purchased in London, his forged documents, and his money. He left everything else behind: his school robes, his books, his wand. He'd have to get a new one somehow, or learn to live without magic. He left a note on his bed, short and simple. Gone. Don't look for me. Then he walked out of the Slytherin dormitory, through the common room, up the stairs, and out of Hogwarts Castle. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was beautiful, and Draco allowed himself one moment to appreciate it, to say a silent goodbye to the only home he'd ever really known. Then he turned his back on Hogwarts and apparated to London. The Muggle airport was overwhelming. Draco had read about airports, had studied pictures and diagrams, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of crowds of people rushing in every direction. The incomprehensible announcements over the loudspeaker, the strange machines that seemed to be everywhere. He felt like an alien visiting another planet, but he'd prepared for this. He had his ticket, his identification, his story ready. He was Daniel Morgan, a 14-year-old traveling alone to visit relatives in New York. It was a thin story, but it would have to do. The security checkpoint was terrifying. Draco had to put his bag on a conveyor belt that fed into a Machinian X-ray machine he remembered from his research and walk through a metal detector. He was certain they would somehow know he was a wizard, that alarms would sound, and he'd be dragged away. But the machine beeped green, and the security guard waved him through without a second glance. He'd passed. He was through. Finding his gate took another 20 minutes of wandering through the terminal, following signs that might as well have been written in a foreign language. But finally he found it. Gate 47, Flight 203 to New York JFK. Draco sat in a plastic chair and watched the planes take off and land through the massive windows. Each one was a miracle of Muggle engineering, tons of metal defying gravity through means he didn't fully understand. In a few hours, he would be on one of those planes, flying across the Atlantic Ocean, leaving Britain and his old life behind forever. His hands were shaking. He clasped them together in his lap and tried to breathe steadily. This was it. This was really happening. Once he boarded that plane, there would be no going back. His parents would discover he was gone. They would search for him, probably. Lucius would be furious. Narcissa would be heartbroken. And Draco would be alone in a foreign country, with no magic, no family, no support system of any kind. It was terrifying. It was also the only way he could live with himself. Now boarding Flight 203 to New York, a voice announced over the loudspeaker. All passengers, please proceed to the gate. Draco stood on shaking legs and joined the line of passengers. He handed his ticket to the attendant, who scanned it and smiled at him. Traveling alone? She asked. Yes, Draco said. I'm visiting family. Well, have a safe flight, sweetie. He walked down the jetway, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. The plane was smaller than he'd expected, with rows of seats crammed together in a narrow tube. He found his seat 14A. A window seat hand sat down, clutching his bag in his lap like a lifeline. Other passengers filed in around him, stowing their luggage and settling into their seats. A businessman sat next to him, immediately pulling out a laptop and ignoring Draco completely. Good. Draco didn't want to talk to anyone. He just wanted to get through this flight without falling apart. The plane began to move, backing away from the gate. Draco's stomach lurched. This was it. This was really, truly it. The plane taxied to the runway, and Draco pressed his face against the window, watching the airport buildings slide past. The engines roared to life, louder than anything he'd ever heard, and suddenly they were moving faster and faster, the ground blurring beneath them. And then, impossibly, they were lifting off. The ground fell away, and Draco watched as Britain grew smaller and smaller beneath him. He could see the city of London, the Thames River winding through it like a silver ribbon. He could see the countryside beyond, green and brown and dotted with tiny houses. He could see everything he was leaving behind. The plane climbed higher, breaking through the clouds, and suddenly there was nothing but blue sky above and white clouds below. Britain was gone, hidden beneath the cloud cover. Draco leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. His hands were still shaking, and he felt like he might cry or laugh or scream. But he'd done it. He'd actually done it. He was free. The flight would take 7 hours. 7 hours suspended between his old life and his new one, between Draco Malfoy and Daniel Morgan, between the wizarding world and the Muggle one. 7 hours to figure out who he was going to be now that he'd escaped his destiny. Dracono, Daniel opened his eyes and looked out the window at the endless expanse of sky. Somewhere far below, the Atlantic Ocean stretched out, dark and deep and full of possibilities. He didn't know what waited for him in America. He didn't know if he could survive in the Muggle world, if he could build a new life from nothing, if he could ever truly escape the shadow of the Malfoy name. But for the first time in his life, in both his lives had a choice. He had a chance, and he was going to take it. The plane flew on through the sky, carrying Daniel Morgan toward an uncertain future. Behind him, in Britain, Draco Malfoy's bed sat empty in the Slytherin dormitory, a short note the only explanation for his disappearance. His parents would find out soon enough. The school would search. Questions would be asked. But by then, Daniel would be in New York, lost in a city of millions, just another face in the crowd. Free. Finally, impossibly free. JFK Airport was chaos incarnate. Draco stumbled off the plane on shaking legs, his body still vibrating with the memory of flight, his ears ringing from the engine noise. The terminal was a maze of signs and people and incomprehensible announcements, all of it moving too fast, too loud, too overwhelming. He clutched his bag, one with the undetectable extension charm containing all his worldly possessions, and tried to remember how to breathe. Immigration was terrifying. The officer, a tired-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, barely glanced at his forged documents before stamping them and waving him through. "Welcome to America," she said in a bored monotone, and just like that, Daniel Morgan officially existed. The city beyond the airport was even more overwhelming than the terminal. Draco had read about New York, had studied maps and guidebooks, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer scale of it. Buildings stretched toward the sky like giants, their glass and steel surfaces reflecting the afternoon sun. Cars honked and swerved through traffic with terrifying speed. People rushed past on the sidewalks, everyone moving with purpose, no one paying him the slightest attention. It was perfect. In a city this large, this chaotic, one 14-year-old boy could disappear completely. Finding an apartment took most of the afternoon. Draco had researched the process, knew he needed something cheap and anonymous, somewhere that wouldn't ask too many questions about a teenager living alone. He found it in Queens, in a neighborhood that the taxi driver described as not great, but not the worst either. A 5-story walk-up with peeling paint and a front door that didn't quite close properly. The landlord was a heavy-set man who smelled of cigarettes and asked exactly 2 questions. "You got first month's rent and deposit? And you gonna cause trouble?" When Draco answered yes and no respectively, the man handed over a key and told him the apartment was on the 4th floor. The apartment was worse than Draco had imagined, and he'd imagined it would be bad. One room that served as bedroom, living room, and kitchen combined. A bathroom so small he could barely turn around in it. A window that looked out onto a brick wall. The furniture consisted of a sagging mattress on a metal frame, a card table with 2 folding chairs, and a mini fridge that hummed ominously in the corner. Draco set his bag down on the mattress and looked around at his new home. This was it. This was what freedom looked like, a dingy room in a building that smelled of mildew and cooking grease, in a city where he knew no one, in a country where he had no connections, no safety net, no way back. He sat down on the mattress and put his head in his hands. What had he done? He'd abandoned his family, stolen from his father, fled across an ocean to live in squalor. He was 14 years old, alone in a foreign country, with no plan beyond "don't get caught." The enormity of it crashed over him like a wave, and for a moment he couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sit there and shake. But then he remembered. He remembered the weight of the dark mark on his arm. He remembered the screams from the manor's dungeons. He remembered standing on the astronomy tower with his wand pointed at Dumbledore, unable to kill, but unable to refuse. He remembered the war, the fear, the constant certainty that he was going to die or worse. This apartment was terrible, but it was his. This life was uncertain, but it was his choice. Draco lifted his head and looked at his reflection in the grimy window. Even in the distorted glass, his platinum blonde hair stood out like a beacon. That was the problem. That was the liability he couldn't afford. The Malfoy hair was legendary in Britain, pale as moonlight, distinctive as a signature. Anyone looking for him would recognize it instantly. And they would be looking. His father would tear apart Britain searching for his missing heir. The ministry would investigate. Even if they didn't suspect he'd fled to America, even if they thought he'd been kidnapped or killed, someone might see him. Some British wizard visiting New York might catch a glimpse of that distinctive blonde and wonder. He couldn't take that risk. Draco grabbed his bag and headed back out into the city. It took him 3 tries to find what he was looking for, a drugstore, the Muggle called them, full of strange products in bright packaging. He wandered the aisles, overwhelmed by choice, until he found the section labeled hair color. There were dozens of options. Blonde, red, black, brown, in every shade imaginable. Draco stared at them, his heart pounding. This was it. This was the moment he stopped being Draco Malfoy and became someone else entirely. He chose a box labeled Natural Dark Brown and brought it to the counter. The cashier, a teenage girl with purple streaks in her hair, barely looked at him as she rang it up. "Dyeing your hair?" she asked, popping her gum. "Yes," Draco said. "Cool, that'll be 8.99. Back in his apartment, Draco locked the door and went into the tiny bathroom. He set the box on the edge of the sink and stared at it for a long moment. His hands were shaking again. This was stupid. It was just hair. It would grow back. It didn't mean anything, except it did. It meant everything. Draco opened the box and read the instructions 3 times before he felt confident he understood them. Mix the color with the developer. Apply to dry hair. Wait 30 minutes. Rinse. Simple. Muggles did this all the time. He mixed the chemicals in the provided bottle, watching the brown liquid swirl together. The smell was harsh, chemical, nothing like the potions he was used to. His hands were still shaking as he began applying it to his hair, working it through from root to tip the way the instructions said. The face in the mirror looked terrified. Pale grey eyes wide, jaw clenched, hair covered in dark brown goop. He looked ridiculous. He looked desperate. He looked like someone running for his life. 30 minutes. The instructions said to wait 30 minutes. Draco sat on the edge of the bathtub and watched the clock on his phonanother Muggle device he'd purchased, still trying to figure out how it worked. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. His scalp itched. The chemical smell made his eyes water. Finally, the timer went off. Draco leaned over the sink and turned on the water. It came out in a rusty brown stream at first, then cleared. He stuck his head under the faucet and began rinsing, watching the dark water swirl down the drain. It seemed to go on forever, the water running brown, then lighter, then finally clear. He grabbed a towel thin and scratchy, nothing like the plush Egyptian cotton towels at the manor, and dried his hair roughly. Then, slowly, he lifted his head and looked in the mirror. A stranger stared back at him. The hair was dark, a rich brown that made his pale skin look even paler by contrast. It changed the entire shape of his face, made his features sharper, his eyes more prominent. He looked older somehow and harder. He looked nothing like a Malfoy. Draco touched his hair with trembling fingers. It felt the same, still soft, still fine, but the color was all wrong. Or rather, it was right. It was exactly what he needed it to be. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. Draco Malfoy was gone, erased, transformed into someone else. Someone his father wouldn't recognize. Someone his mother would walk past on the street without a second glance. The thought should have been liberating. Instead, it felt like drowning. Draco gripped the edge of the sink and tried to breathe through the panic rising in his chest. He was alone. Completely, utterly alone. He'd severed every connection to his old life, burned every bridge, and now he was standing in a grimy bathroom in Queens, staring at a stranger in the mirror, with no idea what to do next. "You're Daniel Morgan," he whispered to his reflection. "You're 14 years old. You're from Chicago. Your parents are dead. You came to New York to start over." The lies felt hollow in his mouth, but he repeated them anyway, over and over, until they started to sound almost true. That night, Draco lay on the sagging mattress and stared at the water-stained ceiling. Outside, the city hummed with life signs wailing, people shouting, music thumping from somewhere nearby. It was nothing like the quiet of Malfoy Manor or the familiar sounds of Hogwarts. It was alien and overwhelming and utterly foreign. He'd never felt more alone in his life. But he'd also never felt more free. The next 3 days passed in a blur of adjustment and anxiety. Draco learned how to navigate the subway system, how to buy food from the corner bodega, how to blend in with the crowds of Muggles going about their daily lives. He was constantly terrified of making some mistake that would reveal him as a wizard, but the Muggles were so absorbed in their own lives that they barely noticed him at all. He was just another kid in a city full of kids, anonymous, invisible, perfect. On the fourth day, everything changed. Draco was walking through Manhattan, trying to find a library where he could use the computers to research American schools and figure out his next move. He just turned onto a busy street, surrounded by lunch-hour crowds, when he felt it. Magic. It was like a pulse in the air, a ripple of power that made his skin prickle. He froze, his heart suddenly hammering in his chest. That was detection magic. Someone was scanning for magical signatures. Someone had found him. "Don't move," a voice said behind him, low and commanding. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Draco's mind raced. Run. No, they'd catch him. Fight. He didn't even have a wand. Lie. That was his only option. He turned slowly, hands raised, and found himself facing two people in Muggle clothing, a man and a woman, both in their 30s, both with the unmistakable bearing of trained fighters. Auras. They had to be. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Draco said, keeping his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "You're a wizard," the woman said. It wasn't a question. Underage, unregistered, and radiating enough magical energy to light up our detection grid like a Christmas tree. "So let's try this. Agin, who are you, and what are you doing in New York?" Draco's mind spun through possibilities, discarding options as quickly as they appeared. The truth was impossible. But what lie would they believe? "My name is Daniel Morgan," he said, falling back on his prepared story. "I'm from Britain. I came here to get away from the war." The two auras exchanged glances. "What war?" the man asked. "The one that's coming," Draco said, and let a little bit of real fear creep into his voice. It wasn't hard. "You know who is back. He's gathering followers. My parents, they were going to make me join. I couldn't, so I ran." It was close enough to the truth to be convincing. The woman's expression softened slightly. "You're saying you're a refugee?" she asked. "I'm saying I didn't want to become a Death Eater," Draco said. "So I stole some money and bought a plane ticket. I thought I'd be safe here. I thought no one would find me." The man pulled out what looked like a wand but was subtly different, American-made, Draco realized. He pointed it at Draco and muttered something under his breath. A golden light washed over Draco, making his skin tingle. "He's telling the truth about his age," the man said. 14, maybe 15, and he's definitely British. The magical signature is all wrong for American training. "But he's not registered with Macusa," the woman said. "Which means he entered the country illegally. That's a serious offense, kid." "I didn't know I was supposed to register," Draco lied smoothly. "I'm sorry. I just wanted to disappear. I didn't mean to break any laws." The woman sighed. "You're coming with us," she said. "Macusa needs to sort this out. If you really are a refugee, we'll help you. But if you're lying, she let the threat hang in the air. I'm not lying, Draco said, meeting her eyes steadily. I swear. The Macusa headquarters was hidden inside the Woolworth building, concealed by layers of magic that made Draco's head spin. The auras led him through a magnificent lobby that seemed to exist in a space larger than the building should contain, past fountains and statues and wizards in robes that looked nothing like British styles. He was brought to a small office and told to wait. The room was sparsely desk, 2 chairs, a window that showed a view of New York that couldn't possibly be real given that they were underground. Draco sat in one of the chairs and tried to calm his racing heart. This was it. This was where his story would either hold up or fall apart. If they contacted the British ministry, if they dug too deep into his background, if they found any inconsistency in his lies. The door opened, and a woman entered. She was older, maybe 50, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and sharp eyes that seemed to see right through him. Mr. Morgan, she said, settling into the chair behind the desk. I'm Director Fontaine. I oversee refugee cases for Macusa. I understand you've had quite a journey. Yes, ma'am, Draco said. Tell me your story, she said. From the beginning, and don't leave anything out, so Draco told her. He wove together truth and lies so seamlessly that he almost believed it himself. He was Daniel Morgan, born to a pure-blood family in Britain. His parents had been Death Eaters in the First War, had gone into hiding when Voldemort fell, but had always believed he would return. When the Dark Lord came back, and Draco was careful to use the American term, the Dark Lord, not you-know-who, his parents had been ecstatic. They'd immediately pledged their loyalty and had begun grooming their son to do the same. But Daniel Draco had to remember to think of himself as Daniel didn't want that life. He didn't want to torture Muggles or fight in a war or serve a madman. So he'd stolen money from his parents and fled. He'd used Muggle transportation to avoid magical detection, had come to America because it was far away and because he'd heard it was more accepting of people who wanted to start over. I know I should have registered, Draco said, letting his voice crack slightly. I know I broke the law. But I was scared. I thought if I went through official channels, someone might tell my parents where I was. I just wanted to disappear. Director Fontaine studied him for a long moment. Your story is plausible, she said finally. And our intelligence confirms that the Dark Lord has indeed returned in Britain, though your ministry is trying to keep it quiet. We've been expecting refugees. Draco's heart leaped. She believed him. She actually believed him. However, Fontaine continued, we have a problem. You're 14 years old and alone in a foreign country. You have no legal guardian, no permanent residence, and no way to support yourself. We can't simply release you onto the streets. I have money, Draco said quickly. I can take care of myself. You're a child, Fontaine said, not unkindly. And more importantly, you're an underage wizard with incomplete magical training. That makes you a liability. We have 2 options. Option 1, we contact the British ministry, explain the situation, and arrange for you to be returned to Britain under protective custody. No, Draco said, unable to keep the panic out of his voice. Please, you can't send me back. They'll find me. My parents will find me. Option 2, Fontaine said, raising a hand to silence him, is that you agree to complete your magical education at Ilvermorny School of Witchcraft and Wizardry under Macusa supervision. You would be a ward of the American magical government until you reach majority at 17. You would be required to follow all Macusa laws and regulations, and you would be monitored to ensure you pose no threat to American magical society. Draco's mind raced. A school. Another school with teachers and rules and other students. It wasn't the freedom he'd imagined, but it was also perfect. A school would give him legitimacy, a place to belong, a reason to be in America. And if he was a student, no one would question his presence. He could hide in plain sight. I'll do it, he said. I'll go to Ilvermorny. Fontaine nodded, as if she'd expected this answer. Very well, I'll make the arrangements. In the meantime, you'll stay in Macusa housing. We'll need to get you properly registered, obtain a legal wand, and prepare you for enrollment. A legal wand? Draco asked. You don't have one, do you? Fontaine said. I assume you left yours behind to avoid detection. It was a reasonable assumption, and Draco nodded. In truth, he'd left his wand at Hogwarts because bringing it would have raised too many questions, but he'd been wondering how he would manage without one. We'll take you to Ilvermorny's supplier tomorrow, Fontaine said. For now, get some rest. You've had a long journey. The Macusa housing turned out to be a small apartment in a building that existed in the magical district of New Yorker hidden neighborhood that reminded Draco of Diagon Alley, but with a distinctly American flavor. The apartment was simple but clean, infinitely better than the place in Queens. Draco collapsed onto the bed and slept for 12 hours straight. The next morning, a young wizard named James escorted him to the wand shop. It was tucked away on a side street, marked only by a sign that read Shakoba's Fine Wands and Staves. Inside, the shop was warm and cluttered, filled with boxes and the smell of wood and magic. An elderly woman emerged from the back room, Native American, Draco realized, with long gray hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. A new student, she said, her voice rich and warm. Come, child, let's find you a wand. The process was nothing like Ollivander's. Shakoba didn't hand him wand after wand to try. Instead, she had him sit in a chair in the center of the room and close his eyes. Magic chooses, she said. We simply listen. Draco sat in the darkness behind his eyelids and tried to quiet his racing thoughts. He felt foolish, sitting here doing nothing while the wand-maker moved around the room, but then he felt Ita pull, subtle but insistent, like a thread tugging at his chest. There, Shakoba said softly. Do you feel it? Yes, Draco whispered. Open your eyes. Draco opened his eyes and found Shakoba holding a wand. It was beautiful dark wood with a slight curve, elegant and deadly looking at once. Blackthorn, Shakoba said. 12 inches. The core is Thunderbird tail feather, a powerful combination. Blackthorn is a warrior's wood, but it's also the wood of transformation. It chooses those who have been through trials, those who have had to become someone new. She held it out to him. Try it. Draco took the wand, and the moment his fingers closed around it, he felt it. Power clean and bright, rushing through him like lightning. The wand warmed in his hand, and sparks of silver light shot from the tip. Yes, Shakoba said, smiling. That's the one. It has chosen you, Daniel Morgan. Hearing his false name spoken with such certainty made something twist in Draco's chest, but he pushed the feeling aside and focused on the wand in his hand. This was his now. Not a Malfoy heirloom, not a wand chosen for him by his father's expectations. His. Thank you, he said, and meant it. 2 days later, Draco found himself standing in front of Ilvermorny School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The castle was nothing like Hogwarts. Where Hogwarts was all Gothic towers and ancient stone, Ilvermorny was built into a mountain, its walls seeming to grow out of the rock itself. It was smaller than Hogwarts, but no less impressive, with a wild, untamed beauty that took Draco's breath away. Director Fontaine had accompanied him, along with James and another Macusa official. They led him through the main entrance and into a hall that reminded him of Hogwarts' Great Hall, but with distinctly American touches-carved wooden pillars instead of stone, windows that showed views of forests and mountains instead of the Scottish Highlands. A man was waiting for them, tall and broad-shouldered, with kind eyes and graying hair. Mr. Morgan, he said, extending a hand. I'm Headmaster Caldwell. Welcome to Ilvermorny. Draco shook his hand, trying not to show how nervous he was. Thank you, sir. Director Fontaine has explained your situation, Caldwell said. I want you to know that you're safe here. Ilvermorny has a long tradition of welcoming those who seek refuge. You'll be treated like any other student. Thank you, Draco said again. Now, Caldwell said, his eyes twinkling, I believe we have a sorting to attend to. The sorting ceremony was held in a smaller room off the main hall. 4 wooden statues stood in the corners: a horned serpent, a wampus cat, a thunderbird, and a pukwudgie. They were beautifully carved, each one seeming almost alive. The houses of Ilvermorny, Caldwell explained. Horned serpent favors scholars, wampus favors warriors, thunderbird favors adventurers, and pukwudgie favors healers. Stand in the center of the room, and we'll see which house claims you. Draco walked to the center of the room, his new wand tucked safely in his pocket. His heart was pounding. This was it. This was where he would either be accepted or rejected, where he would find his place in this new world or be revealed as an outsider. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the horned serpent statue began to glow. It started as a faint shimmer, then grew brighter and brighter until the entire statue was bathed in golden light. The carved serpent seemed to move, its crystal eyes fixing on Draco with an intelligence that was almost frightening. Horned serpent, Caldwell said, sounding pleased. The House of Scholars and those who seek knowledge. A fine choice. Draco stared at the glowing statue, feeling something shift in his chest. Horned serpent, the House of Scholars. It made sense. Had always been intelligent, had always valued knowledge and cunning over brute strength. But it also felt like a validation, like this new world was telling him he belonged. "Welcome to Horned Serpent House, Mr. Morgan," Caldwell said, placing a hand on Draco's shoulder. "I think you'll do well here." The Horned Serpent dormitory was located in the eastern wing of the castle, in a tower that overlooked a pristine lake. The common room was beautiful, all warm wood and comfortable furniture, with large windows that let in the afternoon sun. It was nothing like the slithering common room with its underwater views and green-tinted light. This was bright and welcoming, a place that felt like home. Draco's roommate was a boy named Marcus Chen, a third-year student with an easy smile and a tendency to talk too much. He helped Draco unpack his meager belongings, had to buy everything new, since he couldn't risk bringing anything from his old life, and chattered about classes and teachers and the best places to study. "You're from Britain, right?" Marcus asked. "That's so cool. I've always wanted to visit." "Is it true that Hogwarts has moving staircases?" "Yes," Draco said, feeling a pang of something that might have been homesickness. "They're a nightmare when you're trying to get to class on time," Marcus laughed. "I bet. Hey, you'll like it here. Horned Serpent is the best house to win the academic cup almost every year. And the library is amazing. 3 floors, plus a restricted section that's actually pretty easy to get into if you know the right people." Draco found himself smiling despite his anxiety. Marcus was friendly in a way that seemed genuine, not calculated. It was nice, different from the careful social maneuvering of Slytherin House. That night, lying in his new bed in his new dormitory, Draco stared at the ceiling and tried to process everything that had happened. A week ago, he'd been on a plane, terrified and alone. Now he was a student at Ilvermorny, sorted into Horned Serpent House, with a new wand and a new identity and a roommate who seemed to actually like him. It was surreal. It was terrifying. It was also, somehow, exactly what he needed. He thought about his parents, wondered if they'd discovered his absence yet. Lucius would be furious. Narcissa would be heartbroken. They would search for him, would tear apart Britain looking for their missing heir. But they would never think to look here, in an American wizarding school, at a boy with dark brown hair who called himself Daniel Morgan. Draco Malfoy was gone. He died in that grimy bathroom in Queens, washed away with the blonde hair dyed down the drain. Daniel Morgan was who remained. And Daniel Morgan was going to survive. He had to. Outside, the American night was full of unfamiliar sounds, different birds, different insects, different rhythms than the British countryside he'd grown up with. But as Draco closed his eyes and let sleep take him, he found that the strangeness was comforting rather than frightening. This was his new world, his new life, his new chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. In the bed across the room, Marcus was already snoring softly. Somewhere in the castle, other students were settling in for the night, preparing for classes tomorrow, living their normal lives. And for the first time since he'd woken up in his 14-year-old body, Draco felt like he might actually be able to do the same. He was Daniel Morgan, Horned Serpent, student at Ilvermorny School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He was free, and he was finally home. The first morning at Ilvermorny began with Marcus Chen shaking Draco's shoulder at what felt like an ungodly hour. "Come on, Daniel. Breakfast starts in 20 minutes, and you do not want to miss Professor Blackwood's blueberry pancakes. Trust me." Draco blinked awake, momentarily disoriented. The room was wrong too bright, two warm windows facing the wrong direction. Then memory crashed back. Ilvermorny, America, Daniel Morgan. He sat up, running a hand through his dark hair. Still strange that, still wrong. "Right," he said, his accent carefully neutral. "Pancakes," Marcus grinned, already half-dressed in the Ilvermorny uniformed blue robes with the horned serpent crest embroidered in silver thread on the chest. Simpler than Hogwarts robes, Draco noted. More practical, less ostentatious. Everything here was less ostentatious than what he'd grown up with. He dressed quickly, fingers fumbling only slightly with the unfamiliar fastenings. The robes fit well enough Macusa had provided them along with his school supplies. His blackthorn wand rested in an inner pocket, its weight a constant reassurance against his ribs. The horned serpent common room was already bustling with students when they emerged from the dormitory. Morning light streamed through the tall windows overlooking the lake, turning the water to molten gold. Students clustered around tables, comparing homework or chattering about their schedules. A few looked up as Draco passed, curious about the new student, but most paid him no mind. Anonymous. Invisible, perfect. "So you're taking fourth-year classes, right?" Marcus asked as they descended the spiral staircase toward the great hall. "What's your schedule look like?" Draco pulled the parchment from his pocket. Director Fontaine had arranged it all: transfiguration, defense against the dark arts, potions, charms, history of magic, herbology, and astronomy. Standard fourth-year curriculum. The same classes he'd taken at Hogwarts. The same classes he'd already passed once before. "Pretty standard," he said. Same, mostly. Though I'm also taking magical theory as an elective. It's brutal, but Professor Whitmore is amazing." Marcus launched into an enthusiastic description of the class as they walked, and Draco let the words wash over him, filing away information about teachers and expectations and social dynamics. The great hall at Ilvermorny was smaller than Hogwarts, but no less impressive. 4 long tables stretched the length of the room, one for each house, beneath a ceiling that showed the sky above, currently a brilliant morning blue with wisps of cloud. At the far end, the teacher's table sat on a raised platform. Draco followed Marcus to the horned serpent table and slid onto the bench. Almost immediately, food appeared on the golden plates before them: pancakes, as promised, along with eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, and pitchers of pumpkin juice and coffee. "Told you," Marcus said smugly, loading his plate with pancakes. "Blackwood's the best." Draco took a more modest portion, hyper-aware of the other students around them. A girl with dark skin and intricate braids leaned across the table. "You're the new kid, right, Daniel?" "Yeah," Draco said. "Daniel Morgan. I'm Keisha Washington." "Fourth year, same as you." She gestured to the boy beside her. "This is Tommy Redhawk." Tommy nodded, his black hair pulled back in a neat braid. "Welcome to Horned Serpent. Where you from originally?" Draco's prepared story rolled off his tongue smoothly. "Britain, my family. Things got complicated. Macusa helped me transfer." Keisha and Tommy exchanged a look that Draco couldn't quite read, but they didn't press. Americans, he was learning, were more direct than the British in some ways, but they also seemed to respect privacy more. Or perhaps they simply didn't care about the intricate social hierarchies and bloodline politics that had dominated his life at Hogwarts. "Well, if you need help catching up on anything, let us know," Keisha said. "American magical history is probably different from what you learned in Britain." "Probably," Draco agreed, though he suspected he knew more about American magical history than most of his classmates. He'd spent weeks in the Hogwarts library, researching everything he could about America before his escape. The conversation drifted to other topics squad part. Apparently the American version of Quidditch, played with an explosive ball, upcoming exams, gossip about students from other houses. Draco listened more than he spoke, cataloging information, learning the social landscape. At the Wampus table, a group of students were engaged in what looked like an arm wrestling competition. At the Thunderbird table, someone was showing off a new broom. The Puckwudgie table seemed quieter, more studious, several students already bent over books despite the early hour. Different houses, different dynamics, but not so different from Hogwarts, really. Just lighter, less weighted with centuries of blood feuds and political maneuvering. After breakfast, Marcus walked with him to their first class transfiguration with Professor Whitmore. The classroom was on the third floor, in a tower that overlooked the mountains. Desks were arranged in a semicircle rather than rows, and the walls were covered with diagrams showing various transformations. Professor Whitmore was a tall woman with silver-streaked black hair and sharp, intelligent eyes. She looked up as students filed in, her gaze lingering on Draco for just a moment before moving on. "Good morning, class. Please take your seats. We have a new student joining us, Tade Daniel Morgan, transferring from Britain. I trust you'll all make him welcome." A few students glanced at Draco. Most just nodded and turned their attention back to the professor. "Today we'll be continuing our work on cross-species transformation," Professor Whitmore said, waving her wand. A cage appeared on her desk containing a small tortoise, specifically transforming reptiles into birds. This is advanced magic, requiring precise visualization and sustained concentration. Who can tell me the three primary differences between reptilian and avian anatomy that we must account for? Draco's hand didn't move. He knew the answer: hollow bones, feather structure, respiratory system, but Daniel Morgan, the refugee student just arriving mid-year, shouldn't be quite so quick to respond. A Puckwudgie girl raised her hand and gave a competent answer. Professor Whitmore nodded approvingly and launched into the lesson. Draco had done this exact transformation in his fourth year at Hogwarts. He remembered Snape's derisive comments about Potter's pathetic attempt, remembered his own successful transformation, earning him grudging praise. He knew the wand movement, the incantation, the precise mental image required. But he couldn't be perfect, not immediately. That would raise questions. When it came time to practice, Draco deliberately fumbled his first attempt. The tortoise sprouted a few feathers but remained stubbornly reptilian. He frowned, adjusted his wand grip, tried again. The second attempt was better, more feathers, the beginning of a beak, still not complete. "Good progress, Mr. Morgan," Professor Whitmore said, pausing by his desk. "Especially for your first day. The visualization is the key. Picture the bird in your mind, every detail before you cast." "Yes, Professor," Draco said. On his third attempt, he let the transformation complete. The tortoise became a small brown sparrow that chirped indignantly and fluttered against the cage. "Excellent," Professor Whitmore smiled. "Well done. You can reverse it now." Around him, other students were still struggling with partial transformations. Marcus had managed a tortoise with wings, but no beak. Keisha's attempt had resulted in something that looked more like a feathered rock. Draco reversed his transformation carefully, returning the sparrow to its original form. He caught Professor Whitmore watching him with an appraising look and deliberately made his next few attempts slightly less successful. Too perfect was dangerous. Too perfect invited scrutiny. Defense against the dark arts was next, taught by Professor Hawthorne, a grizzled wizard with scars on his hands and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Draco uncomfortably of Mad-Eye Moody. The class was practicing shield Charmsprout, which Draco had mastered years ago, in both timelines. He let his first few shields be weak, flickering things that barely deflected the practice hexes, then gradually improved, as if learning through repetition rather than already knowing exactly how to layer the magic, how to anchor the shield, how to make it strong enough to deflect even powerful curses. Not bad, Morgan, Hawthorne grunted after Draco's shield deflected a stinging hex. You've got good instincts. Keep practicing. Potions was in the afternoon, in a dungeon classroom that reminded Draco painfully of Hogwarts. Professor Blackwood, same one responsible for the excellent pancakes, apparently was a cheerful witch who approached potion making with an enthusiasm that would have made Snape physically ill. Today we're brewing the Draught of Peace, she announced. Tricky potion, this one. Requires precision and patience. Too much powdered moonstone, and your drinker will fall into a heavy, irreversible sleep. Too little, and they'll experience vivid nightmares. The balance is everything. Draco had brewed this potion a dozen times. He knew exactly how much moonstone, exactly when to add the syrup of hellebore, exactly how many times to stir clockwise versus counterclockwise. He also knew that Daniel Morgan shouldn't be able to brew a perfect draught of peace on his first attempt. So he followed the instructions carefully, deliberately adding his moonstone a few seconds too early. The potion turned a shade too dark, the silver sheen not quite right. Not a failure rate would still work, probably, but not perfect either. Good effort, Daniel, Professor Blackwood said, examining his cauldron. The timing on the moonstone was just slightly off. Try counting to 5 after the hellebore next time. But this is quite good for a first attempt. At the next table, Marcus's potion had turned an alarming shade of purple and was emitting small puffs of smoke. Keisha's looked better, but still not quite right. Draco helped Marcus salvage his potion during the last 10 minutes of class, offering suggestions that were helpful but not too knowledgeable. Just a student who'd read the textbook carefully, not someone who'd brewed this exact potion multiple times before. By the time classes ended for the day, Draco was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. The constant vigilance, the careful calibration of his performance, the weight of maintaining his coverage was draining. He retreated to the library after dinner, claiming he needed to catch up on the material he'd missed. In truth, he just needed space to breathe, to be alone with his thoughts. The Ilvermorny Library was beautiful 3 floors of books with a restricted section that required special permission to access. Draco found a corner table on the 2nd floor, surrounded by books on transfiguration theory, and let himself relax for the first time all day. This was familiar. This was safe. Just him and books and knowledge. He pulled out his transfiguration textbook and flipped through it, even though he'd already read it cover to cover years ago. The American text was different from the British wonderfront examples, different emphasis, more focus on Native American transformation, magic, but the underlying theory was the same. Magic was magic, regardless of which side of the Atlantic you learned it on. Hey, Draco looked up to find a girl standing by his table. She was tall, with pale blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail and sharp blue eyes, a thunderbird based on her robes. Mind if I sit? She asked. Everywhere else is full. Draco glanced around. The library was busy, but not that busy. Still, he nodded. Sure. She dropped into the chair across from him and pulled out her own bookshelves and magical theory. For a few minutes they worked in silence. Then she spoke again. You're the new horned serpent, the British transfer. Daniel Morgan, Draco said. Sage Whitehorse. She studied him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You're good at transfiguration. Whitmore doesn't usually compliment students on their first day. Draco shrugged, aiming for casual. I've always been decent at it. Decent, Sage's lips quirked. Right. That's why you managed a complete transformation on your 3rd try when half the class is still struggling after weeks of practice. Damn, he'd miscalculated, been too successful too quickly. I got lucky, he said. Sure. Sage didn't sound convinced, but she didn't press. Instead, she changed the subject. What's it like? Britain, I mean, the magical community there. Draco chose his words carefully. Different, more, traditional, rigid. Lots of old families with old grudges. Sounds exhausting. It was. Sage nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd suspected. Well, welcome to Ilvermorny. It's not perfect, But at least we don't spend all our time worrying about whose great-great-grandfather insulted whose great-great-grandfather at some party 200 years ago. Despite himself, Draco smiled. That's actually a relief. They worked in silence for a while longer. Draco found himself relaxing slightly. Sage didn't seem interested in prying into his past or questioning his story. She just accepted him as another student. It was strange, refreshing, terrifying. Over the next 2 weeks, Draco settled into a routine. Wake up to Marcus's cheerful morning energy. Breakfast in the Great Hall. Classes where he carefully balanced competence with believable learning curves. Lunch. More classes. Dinner. Homework in the common room or library. Sleep. He excelled in every subject, but never quite perfectly. In Transfiguration, he was consistently good, but occasionally made small mistakes. In Defense, he improved steadily but not suspiciously fast. In Potions, he brewed competent drafts that were never quite as perfect as he knew how to make them. In Charms, he let himself struggle a bit more. Professor Clearwater taught with a different methodology than Flitwick, emphasizing different aspects of the magic, and Draco used that as an excuse for why some spells took him longer to master. History of Magic was taught by a living Professor Rainwater, an elderly wizard with a passion for magical conflicts which made it infinitely more interesting than Binns's droning lectures. Draco found himself actually engaged, even though he had to pretend not to know about certain events that hadn't happened yet in this timeline. Herbology was similar enough to what he'd learned at Hogwarts that he could coast on previous knowledge. Astronomy was astronomy. The stars didn't change based on geography, though the constellations visible from Massachusetts were slightly different than those from Scotland. He made friends, or something like friends. Marcus remained his closest companion, cheerfully dragging Draco to quadpart matches and study sessions and weekend trips to the nearby magical village. Keisha and Tommy became regular study partners. Sage appeared in the library several times a week, and they fell into a comfortable pattern of working in companionable silence. There were others, too. A Wampus boy named Jake, who was brilliant at defense but hopeless at potions. A Pukwudgie girl named Lily, who helped him understand the nuances of American magical history. A horned serpent sixth year named David, who took him under his wing and explained the unwritten rules of Ilvermorny social dynamics. They were kind, welcoming, genuine in a way that Draco's Hogwarts associates had never been, and it made him feel like a fraud, because he wasn't really Daniel Morgan, the British refugee escaping a dark future. He was Draco Malfoy, Death Eater's son, who'd abandoned his mother and stolen from his father and fled across an ocean to escape consequences he'd brought on himself. He was a liar, a thief, a coward, but he was also free. 3 weeks into the term, Professor Whitmore assigned them a complex transformation turning a desk into a pig. It was NEWT-level magic, she explained, but she wanted to see what they could do with it. Draco stared at the desk in front of him. He'd done this transformation before. Not in fourth Yerthais was fifth or sixth year material, but he'd done it. He knew exactly how. Around him, students were attempting the spell with varying degrees of success. Marcus managed to give his desk a curly tail before it collapsed back into wood. Keisha's desk sprouted bristles but remained stubbornly furniture-shaped. Draco raised his wand. He could do this, easily, perfectly, but should he? Daniel Morgan was supposed to be talented but not exceptional, competent but not brilliant. Good enough to belong at Ilvermorny, but not so good that people asked questions about where he'd really learned his magic. He cast the spell, putting just enough power behind it to make the desk shift and squirm but not quite transform. It developed a snout and trotters, but kept its basic desk shapier grotesque hybrid that made several students laugh. Interesting approach, Mr. Morgan, Professor Whitmore said, examining his work. You've got the anatomical details right, but you're not committing fully to the transformation. You need to believe in the change, not just visualize it. Try again. Draco tried again. This time he let the transformation complete about 70% a desk-sized pig with wooden patches on its flanks. Better, but still imperfect. Much better, Whitmore said. Keep practicing. You're close. After class, Sage caught up with him in the hallway. You're holding back, she said without preamble. Draco's heart stuttered. What? In Transfiguration. You know how to do that transformation. I saw your face when Whitmore explained it. You've done it before. I haven't. Don't lie to me, Daniel, or whatever your real name is. Sage's voice was quiet, but her eyes were sharp. I don't care what you're running from or why you're here, but you're deliberately underperforming, and I want to know why. Draco's mind raced. Deny everything, confess, run. I'm not, he started, but Sage cut him off. Look, I get it. You don't want to stand out. You don't want people asking questions. Fine, but you're in Horned Serpent. We're scholars. We value knowledge and learning. And watching you deliberately dumb yourself down is painful. I'm not dumbing myself down, Draco said, though they both knew it was a lie. Sage sighed. Whatever, just think about it, okay? You're allowed to be good at magic here. Nobody's going to punish you for being smart. She walked away, leaving Draco standing in the hallway, his carefully constructed cover feeling suddenly very fragile. That night, he lay in bed listening to Marcus snore and stared at the ceiling. The room was dark except for the moonlight streaming through the windows, turning everything silver and strange. Sage was right. He was holding back, deliberately limiting himself to maintain his cover, to avoid questions, to stay invisible. But wasn't that the point? Invisibility was safety. Mediocrity was camouflage, except he wasn't at Hogwarts anymore. He wasn't surrounded by Death Eater's children and pure-blood supremacists who would report any deviation from expected behavior to their parents. He wasn't under his father's thumb or Voldemort's shadow. He was at Ilvermorny. In America, where nobody cared about the Malfoy name or blood purity or ancient family obligations, where he could just be himself, whoever that was. The thought was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Draco rolled over, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Outside, an owl hooted somewhere in the forest. The castle settled around him with creaks and sighs, alive in the way old buildings were. He thought about his mother, alone at Malfoy Manor, probably frantic with worry by now. He thought about his father's rage when he discovered the theft. He thought about Hogwarts, about the life he'd left behind, about the war that was coming that he'd escaped. And he thought about tomorrow's transfiguration class and the desk-to-pig transformation he could do perfectly if he just let himself. Maybe Sage was right. Maybe he could afford to be a little less invisible, a little more himself. Not Draco Malfoy, that person was gone, washed away with the blonde hair dye. But Daniel Morgan could be brilliant. Daniel Morgan could excel. Daniel Morgan could be the scholar that Horned Serpent valued. As long as he was careful, as long as he didn't reveal too much, as long as he remembered that his freedom depended on maintaining the lie. It was a delicate balance. But then again, Draco had always been good at balancing on the knife's edge between success and disaster. He'd just have to be better at it now. Because this time, the stakes weren't just his pride or his father's approval or his standing in Slytherin House. This time, the stakes were his entire future, and he wasn't going to lose it, not again. The elective selection form appeared on Draco's desk during breakfast 3 days after his conversation with Sage. Oh, right, Marcus said through a mouthful of pancakes. Electives. I forgot they let fourth years add more classes in the spring term. Draco picked up the parchment, scanning the options. The familiar subjects were their ancient runes, arithmancy, care of magical creatures along with some he'd never encountered at Hogwarts. Alchemy, Native American magic studies. Wandlore theory, magical linguistics. What are you thinking? Keisha asked, leaning over to look at his form. I'm adding alchemy. Professor Goldstein is supposed to be amazing. Ancient runes for me, Tommy said. My grandmother says it's essential for understanding protective magic. Draco stared at the list, his mind calculating. Ancient Runcht excelled at it at Hogwarts, could read most runic alphabets fluently. Arithmencid found it elegant, mathematical, precise. Care of Magical Creaturest actually enjoyed it more than he'd ever admitted, though Hagrid's teaching methods had been questionable at best. But which subjects would let him hide? Which would draw the least attention? And then, like a whisper in the back of his mind, "Why are you still trying to hide?" "You okay?" Marcus asked. "You've been staring at that form for like 5 minutes." Draco blinked. "Just thinking." "Well, don't overthink it," Keisha said. "Pick what interests you." That's the whole point. Pick what interests you. Such a simple concept, such a foreign one. At Hogwarts, he'd chosen subjects based on what his father expected, what would look impressive on his record, what would maintain his position in Slytherin hierarchy. Interest had never factored into it. But here, no one knew Lucius Malfoy's expectations. No one cared about Slytherin politics or pure-blood traditions or maintaining the family image. Here, he could just choose. The realization was dizzying. That evening, Draco sat in the library with the elective forms still blank. Sage found him there, as she often did, and dropped into the chair across from him without invitation. "Still haven't filled it out," she observed. "I'm considering my options." "You're overthinking." She pulled the form toward her, scanning it. "Ancient runes, arithmancy, and care of magical creatures. Done." "How do you?" "Because those are the subjects you actually look at in the library," Sage said. "I've watched you. You gravitate toward the runes section when you think no one's paying attention. You've checked out 3 arithmancy texts in the past 2 weeks, and you spent 20 minutes yesterday reading about Archemy breeding habits when you were supposed to be researching for herbology." Draco stared at her. "You're observant. I'm a Thunderbird. We notice things." She pushed the form back to him. "Stop trying to figure out what Daniel Morgan should want and just pick what you actually want. Nobody here cares about your reasoning except you." After she left, Draco sat for a long moment, quill hovering over the parchment. Then, in quick, decisive strokes, he checked 3 boxes: ancient runes, arithmancy, care of magical creatures. His hand trembled slightly as he signed his name at the bottom. Daniel Morgan, not Draco Malfoy, who chose subjects to please his father. Daniel Morgan, who chose subjects because they interested him. The difference felt monumental. Ancient runes met on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in a tower classroom filled with carved stone tablets and ancient manuscripts. Professor Whitmore taught it apparently. She handled both Transfiguration and Runesen. The class was small. Only 8 students, all 4th years or above. Draco walked in on the first day and felt something in his chest unclench. This was familiar territory, safe ground. "Ah, Mr. Morgan," Professor Whitmore said, looking up from a tablet covered in Elder Futhark. "Welcome. We're in the middle of a translation exercise. Please take a seat." Draco sat next to a Pukwudgie girl named Elena and examined the runic sequence on the board. It was a protection charm, he realized immediately. Old Norse, probably 9th century, designed to ward against dark creatures. "Who can tell me what this sequence means?" Professor Whitmore asked. Silence. The other students frowned at the runes, clearly struggling. Draco's hand started to rise, then stopped. "Old habit. Don't be too eager. Don't show off. Don't nobody here cares about the Malfoy name." Sage's words echoed in his mind. He raised his hand fully. "Mr. Morgan, it's a protection ward," Draco said, "specifically against Dragonorse undead. The first 3 runes establish the boundary, the middle sequence defines what's being protected, and the final runes activate the ward and bind it to the caster's intent." Professor Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "That's exactly correct." "Have you studied Old Norse runes before?" "Some," Draco said carefully. "I find them fascinating. Clearly." She turned back to the board, adding more runes. "Can you identify the variation here?" Draco studied the new sequence. "You've added Thurisaz in the 3rd position. That changes it from a passive ward to an active defensate. Won't just keep Draugr out. It'll actively repel them. More aggressive. More dangerous to maintain." "Excellent." Professor Whitmore was smiling now, the kind of smile teachers got when they found a student who actually understood the material. The rest of you, take notes. Mr. Morgan has just demonstrated the importance of runic positioning. A single rune can transform the entire purpose of a sequence. After class, Professor Whitmore asked him to stay behind. You have an unusual depth of knowledge for a fourth year, she said, not unkindly. Where did you study before Ilvermorny? Draco's prepared answer rolled out smoothly. Hogwarts, Britain. I had access to a good library. Hogwarts, she nodded slowly. That explains it. They have an excellent runes program, though even so your understanding is quite advanced. She paused. I'm glad you're in this class, Mr. Morgan. It's rare to have a student who genuinely appreciates the elegance of runic magic. Thank you, Professor. Walking back to the common room, Draco felt something unfamiliar blooming in his chest. Pride, yes, but also belonging. Professor Whitmore hadn't been suspicious or questioning. She'd been pleased, he'd been brilliant, and it had been welcomed. Arithmancy was different. Professor Caldwell, no relation to the headmaster, apparently was a stern witch who expected precision and logical thinking. The classroom was filled with charts and equations, numbers dancing across the walls in glowing script. Arithmancy, she announced on the first day, is the magic of numbers and prediction. It is not fortune-telling. It is mathematics applied to magical theory. If you're looking for crystal balls and tea leaves, you're in the wrong classroom. Draco liked her immediately. The first assignment was to calculate the magical resonance of their own names using the Agrippa method. Simple enough. Draco had done this years ago. Except he couldn't calculate Draco Malfoy anymore. He had to calculate Daniel Morgan. The numbers were different. The resonance was different. According to arithmancy, Daniel Morgan was a 7, the seeker, the thinker, the one who questioned everything. Draco Malfoy had been a 1, the leader, the ambitious, the one who demanded control. He stared at the numbers on his parchment, feeling oddly unsettled. Interesting, Professor Caldwell said, pausing by his desk. A 7. That suits Horned Serpent well. You'll find the theoretical aspects of magic come naturally to you. Thank you, Professor. She moved on, and Draco looked back at his calculations. Daniel Morgan, the seeker, the thinker. Maybe that was who he'd always been, underneath the Malfoy expectations. Maybe the numbers knew him better than he knew himself. The next class, Professor Caldwell presented them with a complex problem. Calculate the optimal timing for brewing Felix Felicis based on planetary alignments and the brewer's birth chart. It was NEWT level work. Draco could see the other students struggling, their quills scratching uncertainly across parchment. He solved it in 15 minutes. Professor Caldwell examined his work in silence, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up at him, eyes sharp. This is perfect, she said quietly. Not just correct perfect. The elegance of your solution suggests you've studied advanced arithmancy before. Draco's heart hammered. Too much. He'd shown too much. I like numbers, he said, aiming for casual. They make sense. Indeed they do. She handed back his parchment. I'd like you to stay after class, Mr. Morgan. I have some additional materials that might interest you. When the other students left, Professor Caldwell pulled a slim book from her desk. This is a 6th-year text on predictive arithmancy. I think you'll find it challenging in the best way, she paused. You're quite gifted, Mr. Morgan. Don't hide it. Horned Serpent values scholarship. We celebrate intelligence here, not suppress it. The book felt heavy in Draco's hands. Thank you, Professor. One more thing. Her voice was gentle. Whatever you're running from, whatever brought you to Ilvermorny mid-year, you're safe here. You don't have to diminish yourself to survive. Draco's throat tightened. He managed a nod. Walking back to the common room, he clutched the advanced text to his chest and tried to process what had just happened. Professor Caldwell had seen through his deliberate underperformance, his careful mediocrity, and, instead of being suspicious, she'd encouraged him. She'd given him permission to be brilliant. Care of magical creatures met outdoors, in a paddock near the forest. Professor Rainwater, same wizard who taught history of magic, apparently handled both subjects. He was waiting for them with a broad smile and a cage full of what looked like small, iridescent birds. "Welcome, welcome," he called. "Today we're working with Archemies. Beautiful creatures, highly protective of their eggs, Anma." "Morgan, excellent. You're already familiar with them, I see." Draco realized he'd been staring at the Archemies with undisguised fascination. "I've read about them," he said, "but I've never seen one in person." "Well, today's your lucky day." Professor Rainwater opened the cage, and an Archemy slithered out, serpentine body, feathered wings, jewel-bright scales. "Who can tell me the most important thing to remember when handling Archemies?" "They're coronoptixic," Draco said before he could stop himself. "They grow or shrink to fit available space, and they're extremely aggressive when protecting their eggs." "Exactly right," Rainwater beamed. 10 points to Horned Serpent. Now the trick is to approach them calmly with respect. They're intelligent creatures. They know when you're afraid. The lesson was hands-on, practical, nothing like the theoretical approach at Hogwarts. Draco found himself genuinely enjoying the weight of the Archemy in his hands, the way its scales shimmered in the sunlight, the soft chirping sound it made when he stroked its feathered crest. "You're a natural," Professor Rainwater said, watching him. "Have you worked with magical creatures before?" "Not really," Draco admitted, "but I've always found them interesting." "Well, you have good instincts. The Archemy likes Yowsi how it's coiling around your arm." "That's trust." After class, as Draco was carefully returning his Archemy to the cage, Jake from Wampus House approached him. "Hey, Morgan, that was impressive. You really know your stuff." Draco shrugged, uncomfortable with the direct praise. "Just read a lot." "Still. If you ever want to study together," Jake trailed off, looking hopeful. "Sure," Draco heard himself say. "I'm usually in the library after dinner." Jake grinned. "Cool, see you there." Walking back to the castle, Draco realized something had shifted. He wasn't just allowing himself to be competent anymore. He was allowing himself to be good, to excel, to help others. And the sky hadn't fallen. His father hadn't appeared to punish him. Macusa hadn't arrested him for being too knowledgeable. He'd just been himself, and it had been fine. Better than fine. The turning point came during defense against the dark arts, 2 weeks into the new term. Professor Hawthorne had them practicing defensive formation show to protect a group against multiple attackers. It was tactical magic, the kind that required quick thinking and spatial awareness. "Morgan, your team leader," Hawthorne barked. "Chen, Washington Redhawk, you're with him. White Horse's team will attack. You have 2 minutes to set up your defense." Draco's mind immediately started calculating angles, shield positions, optimal placement for each team member based on their strengths. Marcus was good with shield charms. Keisha had fast reflexes. Tommy's hexes were powerful but slow. He positioned them quickly, efficiently, explaining his reasoning as he went. "Marcus, center position your shields are strongest. Keisha, left flank row will need to deflect fast. Tommy, right side wait for openings, then hit hard." "What about you?" Marcus asked. "I'll float. Cover gaps, reinforce weak points, coordinate." It was the strategy he'd learned in the war, in actual combat, when lives depended on tactical precision. Sage's team attacked with coordinated hexes. Draco's team held, shields interlocking, deflecting curses with practiced ease. When Tommy's shield flickered, Draco was there, reinforcing it. When Keisha got overwhelmed, he redirected 2 attackers toward Marcus's stronger position. They won, decisively. Professor Hawthorne was staring at him with an expression Draco couldn't quite read. "Where did you learn to think tactically like that?" he asked. Draco's prepared lie died on his tongue, because the truth was he'd learned it in a war that hadn't happened yet. He'd learned it watching people die because their formations were weak, their strategies flawed. "I read a lot of military history," he said finally. "Magical conflicts, strategy texts. Reading is one thing, application is another." Hawthorne crossed his arms. "That was NEWT-level tactical thinking, Morgan, possibly beyond. You positioned your team like someone who's actually been in combat." The classroom had gone quiet. Everyone was staring at him. Draco's heart raced. Too much. He'd revealed too much. They'd start asking questions, digging into his background, wondering how a 14-year-old refugee knew advanced combat tactics. Well, Hawthorne said, breaking the silence. Whatever you've been reading, keep reading it. That was textbook perfect. 20 points to Horned Serpent. The class moved on, but Draco felt Sage's eyes on him for the rest of the lesson. After class, she cornered him in the hallway. "You've been in a fight," she said quietly. "A real one, not practice dueling, actual combat." Draco's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you— Don't lie to me, Daniel." Her voice was gentle but firm. "I saw your face during that exercise. You weren't thinking about theory. You were remembering something real." For a long moment, Draco considered denying it, spinning another lie. Maintaining the careful fiction of Daniel Morgan, the refugee who'd fled before the war started. But he was so tired of lying. "Yes," he said finally, "I've been in a fight, a real one." Sage nodded slowly, as if he'd confirmed something she'd suspected. "The war in Britain." "It's worse than the papers say, isn't it? Much worse. And you got out before." She trailed off, studying his face. "Or maybe not before. Maybe you got out because you saw what was coming." Draco said nothing. Silence was safer than lies. "Okay," Sage said. "I won't ask for details. But Daniel, you don't have to pretend here. Nobody at Ilvermorny cares about British politics or blood purity or whatever darkness you escaped. We care about you, the person you are now." "And who is that?" Draco asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Sage smiled. "Someone brilliant, someone kind, even though you try to hide it. Someone who helps Jake with potions and explains arithmancy to Tommy and makes sure Marcus doesn't blow himself up in transfiguration." She paused. "Someone worth knowing." She walked away, leaving Draco standing in the empty hallway, her words echoing in his mind. "Nobody here cares about British politics or blood purity or whatever darkness you escaped." It was true, he realized. In 2 months at Ilvermorny, not a single person had asked about his blood status. No one cared if he was pure blood or half-blood or Muggle-born. No one cared about his family name or his father's politics or his mother's lineage. They cared about whether he could solve an arithmancy equation, whether he could translate Elder Futhark, whether he was kind to his classmates. They cared about him. The realization was staggering, liberating, terrifying, because if they didn't care about the Malfoy name, then there was nothing left to hide behind. No legacy to maintain, no reputation to uphold, no family expectations to meet. He could just be himself, whoever that was. After that, something in Draco shifted. He stopped moderating his performance in Transfiguration. When Professor Whitmore assigned them, human transfiguration turning a mouse into a snuffbox Draco, completed it on his first attempt. The mouse became a perfect silver snuffbox with intricate engravings, so detailed that Professor Whitmore held it up for the class to see. "This," she said, "is mastery. Note the precision of the metalwork, the stability of the transformation. Mr. Morgan, would you explain your visualization process?" Draco did, and found he enjoyed teaching. Enjoyed sharing knowledge rather than hoarding it as a weapon. In potions, when Jake struggled with a particularly complex wit-sharpening potion, Draco didn't just tell him what he was doing wrong, showed him. Demonstrated the proper way to slice ginger root, explained why the armadillo bile had to be added counterclockwise, helped him salvage the brew. Professor Blackwood watched with approval. "Excellent mentoring, Mr. Morgan. Teaching is the best way to solidify your own understanding." In ancient runes, he and Professor Whitmore began having discussions that went well beyond the curriculum. She'd present him with obscure runic sequences, and he'd analyze them, debate their meanings, suggest alternative interpretations. The other students sometimes looked lost, but Professor Whitmore's eyes sparkled with intellectual excitement. "You should consider advanced independent study next year," she told him after one particularly engaging debate about the differences between Elder Futhark and younger Futhark. "You're working at 6th year level already." In arithmancy, Professor Caldwell started giving him problems from the advanced text she'd lent him. He solved them during lunch, during free periods, sometimes late at night when he couldn't sleep. The numbers soothed him, their logic and precision a comfort against the chaos of emotion. His grades were perfect, not just good perfect, top marks in every subject, and instead of resentment from his classmates he found acceptance, respect, even friendship. Marcus started coming to him for help with transfiguration homework. Keisha asked him to explain her biology concepts she'd missed. Tommy wanted his perspective on history of magic essays. Jake needed potions tutoring twice a week. Draco helped them all, patiently, generously, without the condescension that had characterized his interactions at Hogwarts, because these people weren't trying to use him for his name or his connections. They genuinely wanted to learn, and he genuinely wanted to help. It was nice. Strange and unfamiliar and slightly uncomfortable, but nice. Sage became his closest friend, though neither of them ever explicitly acknowledged it. They studied together most evenings, working in companionable silence in the library or the common room. She pushed him intellectually, challenged his assumptions, made him think harder and deeper. "You're wrong about the Gamp's law exception," she said one evening, looking up from her transfiguration text. "Food can be multiplied if you already have some. It's creation from nothing that's impossible." That's what I said. "No, you said food can't be conjured. That's different from multiplication." They argued about it for 20 minutes, both of them grinning, enjoying the intellectual sparring. In the end, they looked it up and discovered they were both partially right. "Tie," Sage declared. "We're too evenly matched." "Clearly I need to study harder," Draco said. "Clearly I need to study harder," Sage countered. "Race you to the restricted section." They spent the next hour reading advanced magical theory texts, occasionally reading passages aloud to each other, debating interpretations and applications. This, Draco realized, was what friendship was supposed to feel like. Not the calculated alliances of Slytherin, where every interaction was a transaction. Just two people who enjoyed each other's company and challenged each other to be better. It was the best thing he'd ever experienced. But excellence came with visibility, and visibility came with risk. 6 weeks into the spring term, Draco was summoned to Headmaster Caldwell's office. His heart hammered as he climbed the spiral staircase. Had they discovered something? Had Macusa contacted Hogwarts? Had his father somehow tracked him down? Headmaster Caldwell's office was warm and welcoming, filled with books and magical instruments. The headmaster himself sat behind a large desk, looking more curious than stern. "Mr. Morgan," he said. "Please sit." Draco sat, hands clenched in his lap. "I've been receiving reports from your professors," Caldwell continued. "Quite remarkable reports, actually. Professor Whitmore says you're the most talented transfiguration student she's taught in a decade." "Professor Caldwell, me sister, no relation to me professionally, says your arithmancy work is extraordinary. Professor Hawthorne believes you have genuine combat experience." Draco's throat was dry. "I work hard, sir." "Indeed you do. But there's a difference between hard work and the kind of intuitive mastery you're displaying." Caldwell leaned forward. "I'm not questioning your place here, Mr. Morgan. You've earned your spot at Ilvermorny through merit. But I am curious. Director Fontaine's report said you were fleeing the rising conflict in Britain, yet your knowledge suggests extensive, advanced training." This was it, the moment where his carefully constructed cover fell apart. "I had access to a good library," Draco said carefully, "and I studied obsessively. When you're trying to escape a war, you learn everything you can about magic that might keep you alive." It wasn't entirely a lie. He had studied obsessively, just in a different timeline. Caldwell studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "That makes sense. Survival is a powerful motivator." He paused. "I want you to know, Mr. Morgan, that Ilvermorny is a sanctuary. Whatever you're running from, whatever secrets you carry, you're safe here. We don't pry into our students' pasts. We care about who they are now and who they're becoming." The kindness in his voice made Draco's chest ache. Thank you, sir, he managed. That said, Caldwell continued, your exceptional performance has not gone unnoticed. We'd like to offer you the opportunity to take your OW. Seer ordinary wizarding levels at the end of this year, rather than waiting until 5th year. Your professors believe you're ready. Draco blinked. Aye, what? It's unusual, but not unprecedented. Students who demonstrate advanced mastery are sometimes permitted to test early. Caldwell smiled. You'd still continue your education here, of course, but it would allow you to begin NEWT level work next year, which I suspect you'd find more engaging. I'd like that, Draco said, the words tumbling out. Yes, thank you. Excellent. I'll make the arrangements. Caldwell stood, extending his hand. Keep up the remarkable work, Mr. Morgan. Ilvermorny is lucky to have you. Walking back to the common room, Draco felt dizzy with a mixture of pride and terror. They'd noticed him, really noticed him. His brilliance was no longer hidden, it was recognized, celebrated, rewarded. But visibility meant vulnerability. The more people who knew about Daniel Morgan, the brilliant transfer student, the more likely someone would start asking questions, digging deeper, wondering about inconsistencies. He found Sage in the library as usual. Caldwell wants me to take my OWLS early, he said, dropping into the chair across from her. Sage looked up, grinning. Of course he does. You're working at 6th year level in half your subjects. It makes sense. It makes me visible. You're already visible, Daniel. You're top of our year. Everyone knows you're brilliant. She closed her book. The question is, are you okay with that? Draco thought about it, really thought about it. At Hogwarts, being top of the year had been expected. Required, a reflection of the Malfoy name and pure-blood superiority. It had been a burden, a performance, a mask. Here it was just him, his actual abilities, his genuine interests, his real intelligence. I think I am, he said slowly. It's terrifying. But I think I'm okay with it. Good, Sage smiled. Because you're too brilliant to hide, and it was painful watching you try. That night, lying in bed listening to Marcus snore, Draco thought about the path he'd chosen. He'd come to Ilvermorny planning to be invisible, unremarkable, safe in mediocrity. Instead, he'd become the brilliant transfer student, the prodigy, the one everyone noticed. It was dangerous. It was reckless. It was the opposite of everything he'd planned. But it was also the first time in either of his lives that he'd been recognized for his actual self, not his family name or his father's expectations or his house affiliation. Daniel Morgan was brilliant because he was brilliant. Not because of the Malfoy legacy or pure-blood genetics or centuries of magical breeding. Just him, his mind, his work, his choices. The realizations settled over him like a warm blanket. He'd spent his first life trying to live up to impossible expectations. He'd spent the first months of his second life trying to hide from his own abilities. Maybe it was time to just be himself, fully, authentically, without apology. It was terrifying. It was liberating. It was, he realized, the whole point of running away in the first place. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness. The castle settled around him with familiar creaks and sighs. Somewhere in the common room below, someone was still studying, the soft scratch of quill on parchment barely audible. Draco closed his eyes and let himself feel its safety, the belonging, the freedom to be brilliant without consequence. He'd made himself visible. He'd shown the world who Daniel Morgan really was, and the world had looked back and said, "We see you, and you're welcome here." It was more than he'd ever dared to hope for, and if visibility came with risks, well, he'd faced worse. He'd survived a war, escaped a dark lord, abandoned everything he'd ever known. He could handle being brilliant. In fact, he thought as sleep finally claimed him, maybe being brilliant was exactly what he was meant to do. Not for his father, not for the Malfoy name, not for Slytherin House or pure-blood supremacy or any of the poisonous expectations that had defined his first life. Just for himself. Finally, impossibly, just for himself. The summons arrived during breakfast on a Tuesday morning in late March. An official Macusa Owlsleek, Grey, with intelligent amber, Icelanded directly in front of Draco's plate, scattering his scrambled eggs. The envelope it carried was heavy cream parchment sealed with the Macusa crest in dark blue wax. Marcus looked up from his pancakes. Whoa, that's official. Draco's hands trembled as he broke the seal. The letter inside was brief, formal, terrifying. Mr. Daniel Morgan, your presence is requested at Macusa headquarters today at 2:00 p.m. for a matter requiring immediate attention. Please report to Director Fontaine's office on the 7th floor. This is not optional. Department of Magical Law Enforcement, everything okay? Keisha asked, leaning over to look. Fine, Draco managed, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Just administrative stuff about my transfer paperwork. It was a lie. He could feel it in his bones. Thighs wasn't about paperwork. They'd found something, discovered something. The careful fiction of Daniel Morgan was unraveling, and he was about to pay the price. You look pale, Sage observed from across the table, her sharp blue eyes missing nothing. Want me to come with you? No, the word came out too quickly, too sharp. I mean, it's fine, just boring bureaucracy. But his hands were shaking so badly he had to set down his fork. After breakfast, he returned to his dormitory and stared at his reflection in the mirror. Dark brown hair still strange after months of seeing it. Grey eyes that looked too old for his 14-year-old face. The careful construction of Daniel Morgan, refugee student, brilliant but unremarkable, except he'd stopped being unremarkable. He'd let himself be brilliant, let himself be seen, and now they knew. Somehow they knew. The journey to New York felt interminable. Draco took the flu from Ilvermorny's administrative office, stepping through emerald flames into the Macusa arrival hall. The magnificent lobby stretched before him, fountains, statues, witches and wizards moving purposefully through the space. He'd been here before, months ago, when Director Fontaine had first interviewed him. When he'd spun his careful story about fleeing the rising darkness in Britain, about wanting to escape his family's expectations. When he'd lied through his teeth and somehow been believed. His footsteps echoed on the marble floor as he crossed to the lifts. A witch in navy robes glanced at him, then away. Did she know? Could she tell? Stop it, he told himself firmly. You're being paranoid. But paranoia had kept him alive in his first life. Paranoia had got him out of Britain before Voldemort's return. Paranoia was the only sensible response to a summons from magical law enforcement. The lift rose smoothly, numbers glowing above the door. 3rd floor, 4th, 5th, 7th. The doors opened onto a quiet corridor lined with offices. Director Fontaine's name was etched on a frosted glass door at the end of the hall. Draco's hand hovered over the doorknob. This was it, the moment where everything fell apart. He knocked. Come in, Fontaine's voice called. The office was exactly as he remembered it, professional, with windows overlooking the magical district. Director Fontaine sat behind her desk, her dark hair pulled back, her expression unreadable. Aura James stood beside her, arms crossed, and on the desk between them lay a file. A thick file with official stamps and what looked like photographs. Draco's heart stopped. Mr. Morgan, Fontaine said quietly. Please sit down. He sat. His legs wouldn't have held him much longer anyway. Do you know why you're here? She asked. No, ma'am. The lie tasted like ash. Fontaine and James exchanged a glance. Then she opened the file. We've been conducting routine background checks on all foreign transfer students, she said. Standard procedure, nothing unusual. Most cases are straightforward. We verify the information provided, confirm identity, ensure there are no security concerns. She pulled out a photograph. Draco's stomach dropped. It was him, not Daniel Morgan with dark brown hair. Him. Draco Malfoy, platinum blonde, aristocratic features, photographed at some ministry function years ago. Your case, Fontaine continued, was not straightforward. I don't, Draco started, but James cut him off. Don't lie, the aura said, not unkindly. We know who you are. The world tilted. Draco gripped the arms of his chair, trying to breathe, trying to think, trying to find some way out of this. Draco Lucius Malfoy, Fontaine read from the file. Born June 5, 1980, to Lucius and Narcissa Malfoy. Pure blood family, considerable wealth and political influence. Student at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, sorted into Slytherin House. She looked up. Disappeared from Hogwarts in January 1995 without explanation. The British Ministry of Magic has been searching for you for 2 months. I can explain, Draco's voice cracked. I'm sure you can. Fontaine closed the file. The question is whether we want to hear it, or whether we simply contact the British Ministry and arrange for your immediate deportation. Terror flooded through him, cold and absolute. Deportation. Back to Britain. Back to his father. Back to Voldemort and the Dark Mark and everything he'd run from. Please, he whispered, please don't. Then talk, James said. And this time tell us the truth. Draco's mind raced. What could he say? What story would they believe? The truth was impossible. Time travel, future knowledge, a war that hadn't happened yet. They'd think him insane, but he had to say something. My father, he began slowly, is a Death Eater. Fontaine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Recognition. She knew the term. Voldemort the Dark Lord's returning, Draco continued, the words tumbling out faster now. Everyone knows it, even if they won't admit it. And when he comes back, my father will be first in line to serve him. He'll expect me to follow, to take the Dark Mark, to become, his voice broke. I didn't want that. I couldn't. I saw what was coming, and I ran. So you stole from your family vault, James said. Obtained forged documents, fled to America under a false identity. Yes, and lied to us about who you were. Yes, Draco met Fontaine's gaze. I'm sorry, I was terrified. I thought if you knew I was a Malfoy, you'd send me back, that you'd contact the British Ministry, and they'd tell my father, and he couldn't finish the sentence. Silence filled the office. Draco could hear his own heartbeat, rapid and panicked. Finally, Fontaine spoke. The British Ministry has filed a missing person report. They're looking for you. Your father has been quite insistent about Maccus's cooperation in locating his son. Draco's blood turned to ice. What did you tell them? Nothing, Fontaine said. Yet, Draco repeated hollowly. We have a problem, Mr. Malfoy, Fontaine continued. You entered this country illegally, using forged documents and a false identity. You lied to Maccusa officials during your initial interview. Under normal circumstances, we would be obligated to deport you immediately. But these aren't normal circumstances, James added. Draco looked between them, not daring to hope. Fontaine leaned forward. Tell me about Voldemort, about the Death Eaters, about what you think is coming. So Draco told them. Not everything, not the time travel, not the future he'd lived through, but enough. He told them about the Dark Lord's first rise to power, about the Death Eaters who'd escaped Azkaban or bought their way out of charges. About his father's continued loyalty, the whispered conversations in Malfoy Manor, the certainty that Voldemort would return. He told them about the pure blood supremacy, the violence, the fear that had permeated his childhood. About knowing with absolute certainty that when Voldemort came back, Draco would be expected to serve. I didn't want to be that person, he finished quietly. I didn't want to become what my father expected. So I ran. Fontaine was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those sharp, assessing eyes. How old are you really? She asked. 14. That part was true. And everything you told us about wanting to escape the war. True, all of it. Draco's hands clenched in his lap. I just left out who I was running from. Another silence. Then Fontaine pulled out a fresh piece of parchment and began writing. Here's what's going to happen, she said, not looking up from her writing. Officially, Maccusa has no record of Draco Malfoy entering the United States. We have no information about his whereabouts. If the British Ministry inquires, we will continue to have no information. Draco's breath caught. What? Unofficially, Fontaine continued. We are aware that a British pure-blood heir has fled his family to avoid being recruited into a dark wizard's service. We consider this a reasonable asylum claim, given the documented history of Voldemort's regime and the Malfoy family's known associations. You're letting me stay. We're letting Daniel Morgan stay, James corrected. Draco Malfoy is still missing. And he's going to stay missing, Fontaine looked up. But there are conditions. Of course there were. Draco nodded, not trusting his voice. First, you will continue to use the identity of Daniel Morgan. Your true identity remains classified information, known only to myself, Aura James, and Headmaster Caldwell. You will not reveal it to anyone else without explicit permission from this office. I understand. Second, you will report to this office once per month. We'll call it transfer student check-ins. In reality, we'll be monitoring your activities and ensuring you're not a security risk. I'm not, we know, Fontaine said, but we need to verify that. Trust, Mr. Malfoy, is earned. Draco nodded again. Third, if the situation in Britain changes, if Voldemort returns, if your father locates you, if you become a target, you will inform us immediately. Macusa will provide protection, but only if we know what we're protecting you from. Yes, ma'am. And fourth, Fontaine's expression softened slightly. You will continue your education at Ilvermorny. You will excel, as you've been doing. You will build a life here as Daniel Morgan, because that's the whole point of this arrangement, giving you the chance to be someone other than what your family expected. The words hit Draco like a physical blow. Someone other than what his family expected. That was exactly what he'd wanted, what he'd risked everything for, and they were giving it to him. Why? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why are you doing this? Fontaine set down her quill. Because I've read the reports about Voldemort's first war. I know what the Death Eaters did, and I know what happens to children who are forced into that life. She paused. You made a choice, Mr. Malfoy, a brave choice. You chose to run rather than serve. That takes courage. Or cowardice, Draco said bitterly. No, James's voice was firm. Cowardice would have been staying, doing what was expected, following your father's path because it was easier than forging your own. He crossed his arms. You're 14 years old, and you abandoned everything you knew to escape becoming a dark wizard. That's not cowardice. That's survival. Draco's throat tightened. He'd spent months thinking of himself as a deserter, a traitor, someone who'd run away from his responsibilities. But they were calling it survival. Courage. Maybe they were right. So what happens now? He asked. Now, Fontaine said, you go back to Ilvermorny. You continue being Daniel Morgan, brilliant transfer student. You study, you make friends, you build a life. She smiled slightly. And once a month you come here and tell us how you're doing. That's it. That's it. She stood, extending her hand. Welcome to America, Mr. Morgan, officially this time. Draco shook her hand, still half convinced this was some kind of trick, but her grip was firm, her expression sincere. One more thing, James added as Draco turned to leave. Your professors have been asking questions about your advanced knowledge, your unusual aptitude. Headmaster Caldwell is aware of your true identity now, and he'll help manage those questions. But you should know your brilliance is attracting attention. Is that a problem? Only if you make it one, Fontaine said. Be brilliant, Mr. Morgan, just be careful about it. The return journey to Ilvermorny passed in a daze. Draco stepped through the flue into the administrative office, nodded absently at the secretary, and walked through the castle corridors without really seeing them. They knew. Macusa knew who he really was, and they were protecting him anyway. It should have felt like a trap, like exposure. Like the worst possible outcome. Instead, it felt like relief. For months, he'd carried the weight of his secret alone. Every conversation, every friendship, every moment of connection had been built on a lie. Daniel Morgan was a fiction, and Draco had been terrified that someone would see through it. Now someone had, and instead of destroying him, they'd chosen to protect the fiction, to make it real. He found himself in the library without consciously deciding to go there. The familiar smell of old books and parchments surrounded him, grounding him. Sage was at their usual table, surrounded by arithmancy texts. She looked up as he approached. "How'd it go?" she asked. "Fine," Draco said automatically. Then, because he was so tired of lying, complicated. "But fine." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Want to talk about it?" "Can't." "Okay." She pushed a book toward him. "Then help me with this equation. I've been staring at it for 20 minutes, and I'm pretty sure Caldwell made a mistake in the problem set." Draco looked at the equation. It was complex sixth-year level work involving planetary alignments and magical resonance. And Caldwell hadn't made a mistake. Sage had missed a variable in the third line. "Here," he said, pointing. "You forgot to account for lunar interference. Add that factor and the equation balances." Sage blinked, then worked through it again. Oh, you're right." She looked up at him with something like awe. "How did you see that so fast?" "I'm good at numbers," Draco said. It was true, if incomplete. "You're good at everything," Sage corrected. "It's actually kind of annoying." But she was smiling, and Draco found himself smiling back. They worked in comfortable silence for the next hour. Sage on her arithmancy, Draco on an ancient runes translation he'd been putting off. The familiar rhythm of study, of intellectual challenge, soothed something raw inside him. He'd been discovered. His secret was no longer entirely his own, but he was still here. Still Daniel Morgan, still safe. It was a strange kind of freedom, not complete, not perfect, but real nonetheless. The next day, Ancient Runes met in the tower classroom. Professor Whitmore had assigned them a particularly challenging translational runic sequence from a 9th century Icelandic grimoire, layered with multiple meanings and deliberate obfuscation. Most of the class was struggling. Elena had managed the first 3 runes. The others were still staring at the sequence with varying degrees of frustration. Draco looked at it and saw the pattern immediately. It wasn't just a translation, it was a puzzle. The runes were arranged to hide their true meaning, requiring the reader to understand not just the literal translation, but the cultural context, the historical period, the magical theory underlying the spell. It was elegant, beautiful, even. His hand rose. "Mr. Morgan," Professor Whitmore said. "It's a concealment charm," Draco said, "but not for objects for knowledge. The runes are deliberately arranged to appear as a protection ward, but if you read them in the traditional right-to-left pattern, they actually describe a method for hiding magical texts from detection." Professor Whitmore's eyebrows rose. "Go on." Draco stood, moving to the board. "The first sequence says Berkana, Thurisas that looks like divine protection of growth and defense. But in 9th century Iceland, answers was also used to represent hidden knowledge, not just divine wisdom. So it's actually hidden knowledge of growth and defense." He continued, explaining each layer of meaning, showing how the runes interlocked to create a spell far more sophisticated than it first appeared. The other students watched, some taking notes, others just staring. When he finished, Professor Whitmore was smiling. "That," she said, "is exactly correct. Not just the translation, but the analysis of why the runes were arranged this way. You've just demonstrated master-level understanding of runic obfuscation techniques. Thank you, Professor." "Where did you learn this?" she asked, genuine curiosity in her voice. Draco hesitated. The truth that he'd studied advanced runes in his first life, that he'd had years of education beyond what a 4th year should possess was impossible to explain. "I read a lot," he said finally, "and I find the logic of runic systems fascinating. Once you understand the underlying patterns, the variations become clearer." It wasn't really an answer, but Professor Whitmore accepted it. After class, she asked him to stay behind. "I've been teaching runes for 15 years, she said quietly. "And I've never had a 4th-year student demonstrate that level of analytical skill. You're working well beyond your year level. Is that a problem?" "No." She pulled a book from her desk, a slim volume with a worn leather cover. "It's an opportunity. This is a 7th-year text on advanced runic theory. I think you're ready for it." Draco took the book, feeling its weight. Another gift. another teacher recognizing his abilities and encouraging them rather than questioning them. Thank you, Professor. One more thing, Daniel. She paused. Headmaster Caldwell mentioned that you've had an unusual educational background, that your knowledge comes from sources beyond typical classroom instruction. Draco's heart rate picked up. How much had Caldwell told her? I don't need to know the details, Whitmore continued. But I want you to know that whatever you've experienced, whatever you've learned, it's valued here. We don't punish students for being brilliant, we celebrate it. The words echoed what Fontaine had said, what Sage had said, what every teacher at Ilvermorny had demonstrated through their actions. They wanted him to be brilliant. They were encouraging it. It was still strange, still slightly terrifying, but also wonderful. In arithmancy that afternoon, Professor Caldwell presented them with a problem that made half the class groan. Calculate the optimal brewing time for Veritaserum, she announced, accounting for the brewer's birth chart, current planetary alignments, and the phase of the moon. Show your work. It was NEWT-level material, possibly beyond. Draco could see Tommy staring at his parchment in despair. He solved it in 12 minutes. Professor Caldwell examined his work in silence, her quill tapping against the desk. Then she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. This is perfect, she said quietly. Not just correct elegance of your solution suggests you've studied advanced predictive arithmancy. I like the logic of it, Draco said carefully, the way numbers can predict magical outcomes. Indeed, she handed back his parchment. I'm adding you to the advanced study group. We meet Thursday evenings, 6th and 7th years only, but I think you'll find the material engaging. Another door opening, another opportunity to be brilliant without consequence. Thank you, Professor. After class, Tommy caught up with him in the hallway. How do you do that? He asked, not accusatory, just genuinely curious. You solved that problem like it was basic arithmetic. Practice, Draco said, and I've always been good with numbers. Could you maybe help me understand it? I got completely lost after the second equation. In his first life, Draco would have refused, would have hoarded his knowledge, used it as leverage, kept others beneath him to maintain his position. Now he found himself saying, sure, library after dinner. Tommy's face lit up. Really? Thanks, Daniel, you're a lifesaver. Walking back to the common room, Draco realized something had shifted. He wasn't just allowing himself to be brilliant anymore. He was using that brilliance to help others, to build connections, to be the kind of person he'd never been at Hogwarts. It felt good. Strange and unfamiliar, but good. That evening, he found himself in the library with Tommy, explaining arithmancy concepts with a patience he hadn't known he possessed. Keisha joined them, struggling with a transfiguration essay. Then Marcus appeared, needing help with potions theory. Before Draco quite realized what was happening, he was tutoring half of Horned Serpent House. You should charge for this, Sage observed, appearing with her own stack of books. You'd make a fortune. I don't need a fortune, Draco said. I just need, he stopped, unsure how to finish the sentence. Friends, Sage supplied gently. Draco looked around the table. Tommy, working through equations with newfound confidence. Keisha, finally understanding the theory behind human transfiguration. Marcus, taking careful notes on potion ingredients, and Sage watching him with those sharp, knowing eyes. Yeah, he said quietly. Friends, she smiled. Well, you've got them. Whether you planned to or not. Later, after the others had gone to bed, Draco sat alone in the common room, staring out at the lake. The moon reflected on the water, silver and perfect. He'd been discovered. Macusa knew his true identity. His secret was no longer entirely his own. But instead of destroying him, that knowledge had protected him. Fontaine and James were watching, yes, but they were also shielding him from the British ministry, from his father, from the consequences of his flight. And here, at Ilvermorny, he was building something real. Friendships based on genuine connection, not calculated alliances. Academic excellence celebrated rather than resented. A life as Daniel Morgan that felt more authentic than anything he'd experienced as Draco Malfoy. The secret he carried, his true identity, his real past, was a weight. But it was a weight shared now. Fontaine knew, James knew, Caldwell knew, and they'd all chosen to protect him anyway. It wasn't the freedom he'd imagined when he'd fled Britain. It was something more complex, more nuanced. He was watched, monitored, accountable to Macusa's authority. But he was also safe, protected, given the space to become someone new. The door to the common room opened. Sage appeared, wrapped in a dressing gown. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. "Just thinking." She sat beside him, following his gaze to the lake. "About your meeting with Macusa. How did you? You've been different since you got back," Sage said. "Lighter, somehow, like you were carrying something heavy and someone helped you set it down." Draco stared at her. She was too perceptive, too observant. It should have been frightening. Instead, it was comforting. "Something like that," he admitted. "Good." She pulled her knees up to her chest. "You've been carrying too much alone. Whatever it was, I'm glad you have help now." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the moonlight dance on the water. Draco thought about secrets. About the ones he still carried: time travel, future knowledge, the war he'd lived through. About the ones he'd shared: his true identity, his flight from Britain, his fear of becoming what his father expected. The shared secrets hadn't destroyed him. They'd made him stronger. Maybe that was the real lesson. Not that he had to carry everything alone, but that the right people told the right truths could help him carry the weight. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For being my friend. For not asking questions I can't answer. For just being here," Sage smiled. "That's what friends do, Daniel. We show up." She stood, heading back toward the dormitories. At the door, she paused. "Whatever you're running from," she said, "whatever secrets you're keeping, you are safe here. You know that, right?" Draco's throat tightened. "I'm starting to." "Good," she grinned. "Now get some sleep. You have that advanced arithmancy group tomorrow, and I need you functional enough to explain the homework to me afterward." After she left, Draco remained by the window for a long time. He'd been discovered. His carefully constructed identity had been penetrated, his secrets exposed. And instead of collapsing, his world had expanded. Macusa's knowledge of his true identity had become a shield rather than a weapon. His brilliance, no longer hidden, had become a bridge to genuine friendships. He was Draco Malfoy, Death Eater's son, pure-blood heir, time traveler from a dark future. He was Daniel Morgan, Horned Serpent's student, brilliant scholar, friend and tutor. He was both. He was neither. He was becoming something new, something that incorporated both identities without being defined by either. The moon set slowly over the lake. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed midnight. Draco stood, stretching, and headed toward the dormitory. Tomorrow he'd attend his classes. He'd help Tommy with arithmancy and Keisha with transfiguration. He'd engage in complex theoretical discussions with Professor Whitmore and solve impossible equations for Professor Caldwell. He'd be brilliant, openly and without apology. And once a month, he'd report to Macusa headquarters. He'd sit in Director Fontaine's office and answer questions about his activities, his studies, his life. It wasn't perfect freedom, but it was real safety. And for the first time in either of his lives, Draco Malfoy Daniel Morgan, however he was becoming, felt like he might actually be okay. The secret was out, the truth was known, and he was still here, still safe, still building a life worth living. It was more than enough. It was everything.